The Mangroves of Bishop's Valley by Flynn VanDeBerg. Chapter 1, Girl Birthmark. It's with lamentation and sorrow that I officially begin this auditory literary investigation into the mysterious death of Jeremy Scarborough, who had his skin carefully stripped from his flesh and muscles, extracted with a hunting knife, and was subsequently dumped in the mangroves at Green Gills River. I am currently recording, in spite of goose pimples, in my dressing gown, cicadas clicking like a wave across the black stretch of space, a hot Australian sky, tall black grass blowing in the breeze, the glistening stars of the Milky Way, as clear as a river of light above me, country stars. To a soundtrack, the croaking of frogs fall out of step with the cicada's melody. There's so much disorder in the outback. It's so rustic, so sparse, yet somehow, even amidst the random beauty of the Australian bush, nature's chaotic rhythm seems to have some unknown but deeply disturbing meaning to convey to whoever is willing to listen. Seems to be working. Grammatically it's good, and the punctuation is spot on. I'm a little apprehensive, you see, when I discovered the dictaphone feature in Hypewriter, the writer's application I downloaded a few months ago. I had low expectations of the method surpassing conventional typing as a preference for my writing. There's no doubt it's accurate, but there's a kind of shroud, a concern over integrity. I'm worried about editing the words in case I lose my candid voice. That kind of infects the usual methods and professional standard of the medium. All the same, it's a lot more personal. I feel almost as if I'm speaking straight to my readers this way. As my lips hover over my mobile phone in the onyx-colored night. Too pretentious? Normally I would edit that out, but now I'm not so sure. The dictaphone doesn't pick up the chirping in the background, which is lucky. The cicadas have been leaving their crusty brown shells everywhere on the frames of my new residence. Must be the season of the damn things. I'm picking up one in my hand right now, plucking it off the splintered wooden railing. It's sticky, like the skin of a dried fruit. Its legs are sharp and stick into the callus on my forefinger. Ouch! I've had the most pervasive sense of dread since I've come to this place. I don't know what it is. I used to feel misgiving putting honest words down on a page after a haunting or traumatic incident, but recording my voice and having it instantly translated into words is somehow even more daunting. I'm feeling existential, alone in the dark, a little paranoid, listening to the sound of my own voice echo through the desolate valley. Then there were the incidents. I'm supposed to give some character description about myself for depth. I guess, as an introduction, how about if I read you my bio off the dust jacket of my book? It's sitting right here on the divan next to me. Here, let me turn my porch light on. There, in bleak typography. If you were here, you might read the title, The Koala Killer, and an abstract red, clownish bear face, channeling Ralph Steadman, Gerald Scarfe. And then in the inset, you'd see the portrait photo of me. Short, curly brown hair, thick-rimmed glasses, handsome, a pointy, angular face. Let's see here. Flynn VanDeBerg is a stoic Australian writer who... Stoic! In case you can't tell, I didn't write the inset biography myself. A writer who cuts into the unfashionable medium of the occult like a knife. His bold prose... Okay, I won't bore you with the rest of that nonsense. Any fool can arrange sentences, and I'm not into the more pretentious self-aggrandizing aspects of the trade. That is the reason I'm out in this obscure outback town, though. That's my trade. I write about the occult. Don't back off yet. The word simply means, what is hidden? I'm not a con man, not dogmatic or conspiratorial, though sometimes my work can be pretty trite, yes. My investigations at least aim to be candid, honest. The subject remains a niche area of interest. It is marketable, even if it seems often to run hand in hand with charlatanry and pseudoscience. There are unexplainable forces out there. I know that much. I get paid to distribute my writings online, so long as I mention Black Lab Publishing House. A shameless plug, but there you are. I sense you're judging me, but we all have to earn a crust, don't we? Actually, I couldn't be more grateful to Vicky, my publisher. They're paying me to develop my own set of tarot cards this year with a unique Australiana theme. It's a fascinating project. Alongside that, they paid for me free accommodation for my 6-month stay in Bishop's Valley. That is a small rural Australian town about a third of the distance between Sydney and Melbourne. I've got a nice setup here, a beautiful old freestanding house with a patio and a deck which I moved into today, hence the welcome croaking symphony of the cicadas. Bishop's Valley Library is supposedly one of the better libraries in the state of New South Wales for Australian-specific phenomena and history, so I'll be researching over the next few weeks and finalising the tarot deck with my artist colleague via the internet. The tarot deck will be marketed as a promotional bonus alongside an anthology of Black Lab writers' work. I'm actually pretty excited about the whole thing. I'm a tad jittery and nervous. Perhaps that's not to be expected. I'm not married and I have no children, so travelling around the country is ideal for me. I like people. I like to meet them, I mean. I'm more studious than social, truth be told. I like to study people, observe them, make mental sketches for my writing. The girl's light is still on over on the hill. How intriguing! She was intriguing. Sorry, trying to remain linear for your sake. Back on topic, the purpose of this journal is to document my experiences here for the anthology. I only arrived today, so I'm pretty tired. But it's probably better to reflect on the day whilst it's all still fresh in my mind. I pulled off the Hume Highway at about 7:30 after driving for 7 uncomfortable hours. Then I started the long descent into Bishop's Valley, down the forward way. The moment you get off the highway, you notice the lack of council work in the district. The old roads in this part of the country haven't been tarred since the 80s. They're bumpy, with lots of holes. Very gravelly. Sometimes they aren't even road, they're just scattered piles of rocks. On the rough road into the place, you are also treated to the awe-inspiring sight of that unique Australian bushland. The sparse and bent bracken trees along the way, gnarled stones and branches of heaven slanted, miles of red dust, roadkill, and skeletons of dead animals. I couldn't help but feel a kind of bad omen or pretentious premonition as I was driving in, kicking up dust, looking at the haunting slice of spiritus mundi carved into the landscape all around me. It's actually overwhelming to finally set eyes upon the soil here, seeing as I've been doing my own research on this place for weeks now. The indigenous people of this land inhabited the area known as Bishop's Valley for at least 6,000 years prior to European arrival, so I've read. The Warrawol people had a recognized camping ground where tribes gathered annually to fish and hunt wallabies, dingoes, and bandicoots. According to photographs I've seen in books, there are historical signs of the Warrawol people from Murraywell down to the shores of Green Gills River, including rock shelters, rock carvings, and cave paintings, particularly in the western bushlands. It's going to be great to actually see some of these historic sites in person when I start exploring. One particular interesting rock painting I'd like to see is in a cave site near Yolumba Basin. It's about 5 kilometers from my house and it's known colloquially as the Crown of the Shadow King. I've only seen a couple of blurry photos, but according to sources it depicts a curious silhouette of a giant man surrounded by adoring tribe members who are placing a crown of stars upon his head. Some representation of tribal initiation, no doubt. In any case, the painting indicates a rich artistic tradition for the Warrawol people and their Dreamtime legends. I was thinking about all these things as I drove through Murrayvale earlier today. History was dancing on the edge of my imagination, fresh in my mind from research I could imagine how the first Europeans felt, tramping through here. Actually, in terms of the natural landscape, not much has changed since then. It was the explorer and ex-convict John Goldlook who obtained permission from Governor Hunter to explore the area for the first time with a small party back in 1796, alerting the officials to the large river and mangroves at the basin of the valley. The mangroves, in fact, are a mere stone's throw from the house I'm staying in. The river was apparently named Green Gills River after the unfortunate death of one member of the expedition, John Harp, who was found face down in the river, laying in the water, also less than 500 meters down the old bush path which runs from my backyard. Apparently drowned or poisoned. They say that he was quite pale and off-coloured when he was found. Hence came the name Green Gills, from the colloquial Aussie expression likening the dead man to a rotting fish. I was almost disappointed to learn this fact. My initial thought on hearing the name Green Gills River was that it may have been the home of a friendly green troll named Grill. But there you are, the truth is more gruesome than fiction. Governor Macquarie granted Lord Haysbury 3,000 acres of land here in 1819 and put him in charge of developing an arterial road. That was the Forward Way which I drove down this afternoon. The first landowner in Bishop's Valley was one Captain Errol Flinders, who named his farm Chapel of the New Sun, using convict labour to run the farm, which was eventually sold in 1816. There was a fair amount of livestock here in the earlier days. Over 25 years from 1790, many other farms were built, and a great deal of timber cutting in the region began. It was particularly a hotspot for the popular Blakely's red gum timber. As most provincial towns, the place was marred by tragedies of all sorts. A bushfire killed half the town's population in the earlier 19th century, and there was even a rather unusual outbreak of leprosy in the 1830s. By 1836, many convicts had been granted land to farm. Hans and Eileen Webster purchased a large plot of land along what would become Prime Street in 1938, the main commercial street in Bishop's Valley. The area became renowned for its cultivation of onions, due to the rare red soil, and was frequently attacked by raiding bushrangers, thieves, and tribespeople in the early years for vegetables and livestock. John Bauman surveyed the entire area in 1832, calling it a paradise, and settlements also begun on the two nearby areas of the twin mountain bases in Morrovale and Upper Bodie, which would become the more industrialized towns as the region developed. I only got a short look at Upper Bodie in my way in today, and I will hopefully return there in coming weeks. But from what I saw of Morrovale, it's a pretty ugly steelworks town. I had reservations driving through there at all, based on the looks of some of the frightening ochre townsfolk. From what I can discern from history books and early writings, Morrovale was a popular stopping point for migrators and travellers. The Black Gum Hotel was a favourite stopping place for Cobb & Co. coaches, which travelled down that way. Morrovale was also a refuelling place for locomotives on their way from Sydney to Melbourne, and thus did attract many nefarious types fleeing Sydney to escape criminal charges. Lots of mafia and underworld figures hailed from Bishop's Valley back in the day. Morrovale also happened to be very close to the path of the famous explorer Hamilton Hume, whose great expedition would become the path of the future Hume Highway, the main roadway from Melbourne to Sydney. This no doubt aided the area's industrial growth, and it explains its unique modern ugliness. The steelworks, engineering works, and coal trade all thrived in Morrovale. Coal mining went through a surge in the 1850s with established mines in Upper Bodie and Bishop's Valley. Copper and asbestos mining also achieved success. BHP Steelworks had a factory there from 1920. Since the steelworks closing in Morrovale in the 1990s, the whole region has apparently been forced to re-evaluate its employment and industry options, which to be honest I have no idea how they're managing. It will be interesting to analyze this in coming weeks. Morrovale developed the first police barracks and post office over 100 years and 50 150 years ago, which served most of the surrounding area well enough, although the Bishop's Valley Private Police Unit, the Blue Boys, have maintained a healthy power ever since, which is entirely strange under Australian laws, and I'm also shocked, keen to uncover the facts of how Bishop's Valley has somehow managed to evade Australia's heavy gun laws, housing the widest array of private guns I've ever heard of in this country. There's even a double-barreled shotgun hung neatly above the fireplace in my temporary abode. I checked to see if it was loaded, dumbstruck to find it indeed was, later finding a gun cupboard packed with cases of shells. Well, I was quite happy to pass through Morrovale this afternoon and come down the windy serpentine road that leads to Prime Street, Bishop's Valley. The bushland on the mountains to the west and east of Morrovale and Opal Body are said to be largely unexplorable. They appear as strikingly beautiful purple mountains as you drive past. The bushland was labelled a national park in 1879, but was reverted to private ownership in 1890 to the Cathar Council. Another curious fact I noticed in my research. There seems to be a deep religious current to the history of Bishop's Valley. A Catholic church was established in the region as early as 1821. Quickly, a significant clerical community identified as a point of organisation for the holy orders in other parts of Australia. Cardinal del Soir built a large manor house on Fruitbat Road, having the rather conservative belief that Australia should continue along feudal Catholic lines. With the helm right here, he named the manor Cardinal House, and it apparently still stands today, though I've not yet seen it. The area, which was originally called Bishop's Head in 1867, but was for some reason renamed Bishop's Valley in 1955, evidently influenced by the clerical community here, though I've not yet been able to pin down the exact etymology of the name. I gather much has changed here from the older days, and there is not a great deal of information on modern life in the small town. The recession of the 1880s caused great problems and unemployment in Bishop's Valley, then Bishop's Head, with a number of families having to leave en masse exodus. Roads connecting Morrovale, Upper Bodie and Bishop's Head were built by a convict chain gang. These roads included Forward Way and Serpentine Road. A bridge at Serpentine Road was also constructed back in those early years, leading onto Prime Street at the centre of the town. As I drove over the bridge, I was surprised to find my old Ford Fairlane nearly lost its grip, running over the rickety wooden slabs, and I wondered if the townsfolk didn't need a four-wheel drive to manoeuvre safely along these wild outback roads. My suspicions were later to be confirmed. As you drive down Prime Street, you can see how quaint the old town is. It's remained almost entirely residential, except for a few shops along the main drag. There's an old corner store maintaining that early 50s hand-painted American milk bar quality, and a curious collection of doctor's surgeries. The first school was built in 1880. Bishop's Head Public School retains the original name of the town and I think is somewhere on the south side, which I didn't explore today. Many of the homesteads still retain the late Victorian style of the peak growth period. There's an array of rather gorgeous multicolored roofs as you drive in. The animals in the paddocks were all up at the fences, staring curiously at my car as I passed, as if traffic was a rarity, and I saw no people at all on the streets' paddocks. Bizarrely, the first census in the area amounted to 96, and 3 years ago the census indicated the population was about 4,340, so it's hardly a rapidly growing population, but I expected to see some sign of life. Of the population's heritage, 70% are Italian, Irish or Anglo-Saxon, with the remainder being of various Eastern European nations. It's a fairly white-bread place, to say the least, an archaic relic of the past, not unlike a lot of these backwater Australian towns. God knows what became of the indigenous population. I'll be doing some research on the matter in coming weeks. I was amazed by the colour once you left the dry bush. Some impressive flower beds are kept in well-tended gardens. Vibrant rainbows of tonality and pretty splotchy multicolored hues. Local flora include Blakely's red gum, New England stringy bark, silver-top stringy bark, blackberry, bracken, lantana, and other invasive weeds are also common. I could see them intruding sinisterly through various yards and fences. There are abundant forms of local wildlife which, with the many streets in Bishop's Head, are named after. There are many pest animals here too, so I understand, including foxes, rabbits, and feral goats. The area historically was also once host to vast populations of Australian megafauna, but that's getting into ancient pre-human history. I drove a little bit around the town to explore before arriving at my leased house, mainly absorbing the quaint homesteads and reading all the road names named after local fauna. Karawang Road, Magpie Place, Echidna Street, Black Snake Lane, Fruit Bat Road. There were some lovely buildings on Fruit Bat Road, truly magnificent, but I didn't travel far enough to see the old Cardinal Place, Red Belly Drive, Huntsman Street, Crow Street. Finally I came to my own street, Livestock Circuit, which wound around to a cul-de-sac where my grand old house stood at number 7. It's a big old style farmhouse, painted a pale lime colour. Not the most attractive place, but for 6 months it'll do me just fine. I had been extremely daunted by not seeing anyone in the town on the drive-in, wondering where the hell everyone was, when I chanced on the girl walking through the old bush trail. She took me by complete surprise. Somehow, I hadn't at all expected to see such a modern-looking, youthful, dare I say, extremely attractive young woman to live in a rural setting like this. Trumping loudly on loose stones, she had a kind of rosy blonde hair, short cut to her shoulders. Her clothes were casual, almost farm-like. She was extremely skinny, but flushed and lively looking. The girl had raised her arm at me and waved from 20 meters away. "You must be the one moving in," she yelled out gleefully. "I guess that makes us neighbors." Then she had got an excited look in her eye and turned to run off. "I'll come and introduce myself. Just let me have a shower and get changed first. I've just been running and I'm all sweaty," she had said. With that she had slipped off before I'd been able to say a word. This was well before the sun went down, but the girl indeed proved true to her word and did indeed return in 3 or 4 hours. In the meantime, I had begun to unpack my car. The sun was getting low in the sky, and I was feeling flustered by the sense of desperation to the town. Could I really live here in the middle of nowhere? As the sun sank, the local red gums began to glow in the fuzzy dark like frozen fire, arms twisting and glowing in the night like flames. I began to fantasize, believing I could be in some medieval town, totally cut off from industry, another time entirely preserved. A piece of the past, with people for who all intents may prove to be completely hostile towards me, a different class of people to myself, me a city slicker. But the girl, at least, had been friendly. That was a positive sign. It took me about an hour to unload all my things from the back of my dinky old Ford. I haven't bothered to even begin opening the boxes tonight, leaving them stacked up in the living area. There was some mail addressed to the householder from an electricity company tucked under the door. I had to chase away some rogue ibises from the porch. Then I entered to soak up the fully furnished, lavish interior. The inside of the house was indeed quite spectacular. The house was apparently once owned by a Catholic clergyman, but is now by a salesman who upkeeps the original household, exactly as it was left by the priest, who I'm told died of natural causes. The old floorboards creaked under my New Balance runners. The furniture was very conservative in its quality, coming off almost like an old monastery in the kitchen. And fridge and the like have evidently not been modernized since the 70s, giving them a dingy bohemian feeling. The back of the house plays like a collection at a museum, filled with quite phenomenal paintings of the area, indigenous art and historical pieces kept in glass cases. I had initially gravitated towards an elegant mahogany chessboard displayed on the classical-styled antique Louis V dining table. It was a beautiful hand-carved board with classic European, probably German figures. Delicately, I had picked up one of the fragile pieces, a bishop, fingering it gently to find the wood was very old and splintering at the diagonal cut of the mouth. markedly, and without any sudden movement I suddenly felt the shards of bishop wood pierce my thumb. A dark globule of crimson blood immediately formed on my thumbprint, and I dropped the piece to the floor, yelling with pain. The dark blood ran, flowing thinly, and began to sprinkle Jackson Pollock-like spirals, first on the chessboard, then on the lacquered hardwood floor. I stuck my thumb in my mouth, rushing to the kitchen. The salty blood caused my tongue to salivate, and putting my thumb under the tap, already free of pain, I began to contemplate dinner. I'd known there wouldn't be much open when I arrived, so I'd cleverly anticipated my hunger and picked up a large meat pie at a truck stop on the highway, which shortly thereafter I sat down and supped upon, already forgetting my thumb, which now only stung with a dull, throbbing sensation. I picked up the piece of paper on the grand table as I spooned the delicious pastry and mince and gravy into my mouth. "Preserving the possessions of Archbishop Raymond Gubbles," it read. "Dear Tenant, as caretaker of number 7 livestock, you are to be completely responsible for the upkeep of all possessions in the house, and any damages to the possession will be repaid out of your tenant bond. All items upstairs are free for perusal, and items which aren't in case may be used at your careful leisure. It is advised you do not concern yourself with any of the items in the basement beneath the back stairs, as these are merely for storage and not part of the Heritage Museum. We hope you enjoy your stay in Bishop's Head. All questions can be directed to Blacklap Publishing, who will handle all real estate and tenant issues directly with the client." I stuffed another scoopful of the delicious meat pie covered in tomato sauce and masticated loudly, milling things over in my brain, spitting flakes of pastry as I mumbled to myself. I found it interesting that the anonymous writer of the letter had used the old name of the town, Bishop's Head, instead of Bishop's Valley, but shortly changed tracks of curiosity. The mention of a basement had got immediately more curious. The owner clearly didn't appreciate the mind of a writer, moreover of a researcher of the occult, as the very nature of the business revolved in opening doors that one is not supposed to. The doors of perception, as Jim Morrison said. You got to break on through to the other side. I resolved to have a little explore around the backyard once I finished dinner, before it got too dark. That was about 3 hours ago now, when I had ventured out into the back garden and saw the padlocked green door leading to the basement beneath the house. I had checked the keys on the large copper ring which my publishers had given me, and tested all of the keys in the curious padlock, only to find that none of them fit. But to my relief, my agonizing pondering was mildly satiated when I saw the small glass window which looked into the room. It was dark in the basement, but I could still make out a large wooden table and shelves, covered in mostly commonplace items, and became temporarily satisfied that there was no great mystery to the basement itself, but it was, like the letter suggested, merely a place for storage of private heritage items. One curious thing I was to note was the odd synchronicity to some of the objects stored in that dim room, which did strike a chord with me, being the same as that of the minor arcana of the Australian tarot deck which I was creating. If you yourself are not a student of the occult, the tarot is basically an Italian ancestor of the playing card, and just as modern cards have 4 suits, the tarot also traditionally has 4 suits, though instead of hearts, spades, diamonds, and clubs, the tarot has wands, pentacles, swords, and cups. These are referred to as the minor arcana and provide the basic units of meaning which a fortune teller accesses in their alleged process of divination. I'll no doubt get more in depth with this information regarding the tarot later. But to explain briefly the coincidence, for my own tarot deck, I had created a new arcana featuring the 4 suits, rifles, candles, cups, and opals. So you can imagine the mild unease I felt observing the stacks of packets of candles and lines of precious opals along the shelves in the basement under the stairs. Opal mining is unique to Australia, and there may even be an opal mine in Upper Bodie, so it's not entirely an unusual discovery. It also makes sense that the agents would have locked the door, given the value of the precious stones, Still, it is my profession to observe coincidences and evaluate if they are indeed random incidents, or if they may perhaps form a pattern or tapestry of greater mystical meaning. The synchronicity wedged itself in my mind, but I was able to move on and explore the vast, unkempt backyard of number 7. It was evident that there hadn't been any gardening done in the yard for many decades. The bush was wild and overgrown. There were giant hirsute banksia trees and ivy running over large rocks, and the perimeter itself ran off into unexplorable bushland, the only avenue of interest being the rustic but man-cleared path which I knew must run down to Greengills River. I knew I wouldn't be able to get a great look at the river now, when it was getting dark, but I figured it couldn't hurt to have a quick exploration of the trail. So, pushing the spidery branches aside, I began to walk cautiously along the rugged path. The cicadas were only just beginning their song at this time, and the valley was mostly of an unearthly quiet. Dry branches cracked under my feet as I descended the muddy trail, pushing leaves out of my face, occasionally being whipped by hard sticks. I had been walking for only 7 minutes when I began to second-guess myself. The dusk was really in full swing now, and it was getting increasingly difficult to see. Sandflies and mosquitoes began to nibble at me. There was something else, too, an anxious feeling rising within me. There were 2 smells which really turned my guts and made me uneasy: marijuana smoke and the smell of mangroves. That latter disagreeable smell was now growing extremely strong. The vile smell of natural compost, an ecosystem of rotting, festering, dead organisms, was even saltier, even more horrible than any previous encounter with mangroves I had had. I was still on the path, but I could hear the coastal wind below, blowing up through the estuary and into Greengills River. The slow, heavy wind almost sounded like breathing, as the sound of the river tide lapping on the shore also became audible. The mud was getting thicker and squelched around my ankles when out of the blue I lost my grip and slipped forward, landing awkwardly on my face and neck and sliding down the muddy slope, stopping only after descending 3 meters and bogging myself. I lifted my muddy face off the ground contemptuously, at first resentful, then happy to be relatively unscathed. As I put my hands out to push myself up onto my elbows, I almost gagged. I knew the smell of death had been more pungent than mere mangroves. Before me lay the carcass of a rotting kangaroo. In the dim light of the moon I could see its festering flesh, the skull beneath its dried black eyeball, grey decaying meat, wrecked in all its hideous horror. I sprung carefully to my feet. Yes! I had had quite enough exploration for one night. I tried to erase the memory of the poor animal's mangled body from my mind, scaling back up the path and using my hoodie to wipe the thick, stinking mud from my face and eyes. It wasn't the image I would normally like to present to myself to the world, a mud-riddled vagrant, whipped and cut from thorns and branches, staggering blindly from the bushes like a madman. You can imagine my embarrassment when I came to the top of the garden path and found the girl from earlier waiting coyly and patiently in my backyard. "Oh my," said the girl, suppressing her fit of giggling with her hand to feign empathy. "Having a look around?" I looked up, still trying to scrub the foul-smelling mud from my face. Hello," I stammered awkwardly, walking out into the moonlight. "Are you hurt?" she asked genuinely. I looked at her through one good eye, holding the stinging mud-stained one loosely with my dirty hand. "Not really," I said, still wiping. We soon moved to a nearby patch of grass at the base of the old concrete steps. "Oh," I said, awkwardly fumbling for the ring of keys in my pocket. "Please do come in for some coffee or tea. Just let me wash my face as I unlock the door." She smiled and pulled something out of her khaki bag. "I've got something even better here, a housewarming present." She twisted her hips and held out a bottle of boutique red wine, grinning profusely. I took the bottle obligingly and opened the door in resigned humiliation, moving rapidly toward the kitchen. The cicadas were croaking incessantly by then, and I was ready to break down emotionally, backing away from the stranger and sinking into my own maudlin privacy. But the girl, with some bizarre country charm, refused my city body language blockades, moving straight over and grabbing a sponge. "Let me help you with that," she said kindly, soaking a queenly portion of water and violently dabbing the mud from my face. I removed my glasses. "My name is Phoebe," she said, her big brown eyes staring motherly into my own. "Phoebe Rimbaud. I live up on Crow Street. Don't worry, I'm a freak here too. Been here 2 months. I'm from Adelaide." I surrendered to her hospitality, throwing my muddy hoodie into the sink and moving my neck so she could clean the hardening mud from my left ear and neck. "Flynn," I replied calmly. "Flynn VanDeBerg. I'm a writer," she said, turning around politely while I took off my shirt. "I know. I'm contacted by the same publisher. That's why we're here. That's why we're all here," she said, accentuating the sentence in a curiously morose tone, moving over toward the table and picking up my book, which was at this time still inside. Before, well, you get it. She began to casually flip through the pages of The Koala Killer. Rimbaud, I thought to myself. She must have French relatives. "We all?" I asked, genuinely puzzled, returning to our conversation. I turned around, cleaned and clothed, putting my glasses back on, only to find the girl had disappeared. Finally, I noticed the ajar front door. "Grab some glasses, I'll fill you in," she yelled from outside. I didn't even know if the house was furnished with wine receptacles, but quickly tufting my hair in the mirror, opening a few cupboards, I found 2 large wine glasses and meandered toward the door. As I came out on the veranda, I found the girl positively relaxed, draped over the outside recliner like someone on a beach holiday. The bottle of wine sat open on the table next to my book, which she had skim-read and discarded. "You mentioned other people," I asked. "I wasn't aware that—" She sat up, motioning her hand towards the bottle of wine as if to hurry me along. "No, it's not what you think." Quickly, I strode towards her, placing the glasses flat and gently pouring 2 full glasses of the rich crimson liquid. "I'm not here to do with anything to do with your deck. I just heard about you through my agent. I'm an editor, but they may have sent me down here to escape out the place. Before they sent you and your friend down, I think. There's 3 of us, my flatmates. We're kind of a group," she said, laughing strangely. "It's a local wine, from Upper Bodie, actually. A Cabernet Merlot." She pointed to the wine again. "A good drop." I began to notice a mildly manic personality that I hadn't detected in it all when we had first laid eyes upon each other. I took a sip of the wine as she threw half a glass down her throat. There was something dangerous about this girl, like Nancy Spungen or Courtney Love. Something broken in her eyes. "I'll take you tomorrow and introduce you around, eh? Get to know the locals. That's why you're here, right? So what do you think of the place, huh? It's just heaven, isn't it?" She kind of leapt back onto her feet as if she couldn't get comfortable anywhere, topping up her wine and then moving on to lean her hands on the balcony ledge. I finished my glass to catch up with the mad girl, filling up another glass and moving in beside her. The cicadas changing from a song of isolation and loneliness to one of tension and romance. "Are your parents French?" I asked, making conversation. She turned her head stiffly and raised an eyebrow, not saying anything, but merely giving me a vacant look. "I don't talk about my parents," she finally said, turning back out towards the dark bush beyond. She drifted back into a fantasy. "Look out there. Nature is a living beast, a darkness with no answer. Isn't it bizarre? But we treat it as though it's all so commonplace. We're like these alien experiments grown inside one another, wet wombs, nature's Frankenstein, Dr. Moreau's animals. So what do we do with the great gift of life? Build houses, get mortgages, hide away from nature, start corporations. What are we afraid of? Of living, I think." I raised my eyebrow now, taken aback by her strange rants, her unabashed soliloquies, giving wine to strangers, her odd comfortableness and yet constant discomfort in the skin. She was unfazed by my facial expressions, moving to face the other way. "I'm sorry, I'm actually really tired," she said in a different tone, like a bipolar personality. "I'll come down tomorrow night, show you around. Don't worry, I think you're going to like it here. What's not to like, right?" Saying this, she turned around again, facing me with a sudden vulnerability, holding her glass with two hands in her crotch, shrugging and looking up through scared eyes. She seemed to crave comfort, moving towards me like a kangaroo, trying to brush its head against the stubborn father. "Are you," she asked, are you seeing anyone?" With that, she placed one of her hands gently on the side of my jeans, running her fingertips honestly along my leather belt. I got caught up in her eyes, leaning in within inches of her neck. I felt my wine glass going limp in my hands, and my body begin to grow warm. My lips grew thirsty, and I almost began to kiss her neck, until, breathing heavily, I managed to pull myself off, escaping the seduction. As I raised my head, I noticed something just under her shirt collar. Gently raising my arm, I pushed the collar of her blouse to one side. There was a curious mark about the size of a 5-cent coin. It comprised of two parallel lines with twirled ends, and a swirl like a 9 or a 6 on each side of the line. I began to speak softly. "How did you get this?" Suddenly she changed again, pushing herself violently away. "It's just a stupid birthmark," she yelled angrily. You're pretty nosy for someone who's out of their depth in a foreign town. It's been a long day, I got to get home." Then she grabbed the bottle and took off into the dark. I could see her silhouette walking up onto Crow Street and into the big 3-story house with lots of lit windows, watching, awestruck, as she disappeared. What just happened? That's pretty much caught up to where I am now, not just a little baffled, perplexed. The sound of my voice, a digital record making the insecure seem temporarily secure. The taste of wine and perfume have all conspired, worked me into a heightened state of arousal and anxiety. I wonder if Phoebe will still come by tomorrow. I wonder what that mark really was. It looked more like a burn than a birthmark. The edges were raised, pink like a scar. I'm standing on the veranda. There's a crippling quiet, but I can see something now. It's 10:30 at night. So quiet here. Nothing but the cicadas and the breeze. You could hear a car from a mile away coming down Serpentine Road. That's just what I hear now. Then I can see the lights move like sinister lanterns along the winding road of Serpentine. 3, 4 cars coming into town. 5, 6... But who? Why? I slowly reach over and pick up my book, anxiously trying to curb the suspense with self-distraction. 2 of the template cards of my designs for the major arcana of the tarot deck, which were in the back, fall out onto the table. Judgment. The image of a barrister wearing an old powdered wig, looking studiously at case files in his fine blue silk gown. The Milky Way. A picture of that great river of stars which I can see so clearly above me in the crisp country sky. My heart starts to pulse in my chest. 4 black cars pull into my yard, engines spluttering loudly. The spotlights blind me. This is the end of Chapter 1. The Mangroves of Bishop's Valley. Chapter 2. Pale One Beneath the Canoe. It's 1:30 a.m. Wednesday morning. Since I arrived in Bishop's Valley on Monday afternoon, my time here has already been strange and troubled. Whilst I'm willing to admit that my temperament is typically paranoid, I can't help but sense a vague notion of conspiracy somewhere in all of this. I just haven't managed to put all the pieces together yet. I'm recording this journal entry on the grass outside number 13 Crow Street. Cicada chirping remains omnipresent. I think my earlier companions are asleep or in a drugged-out daze, trying to escape the dictaphone. Like quality, my writing seems to be taking on, but the evolution seems inevitable. No closer to solving the mystery of the violent and grotesque murder of Jeremy Scarborough. The scratches and bruises on my body from my fall down the path towards the mangroves in my backyard were minimal. My thumb, however, which I had merely pricked ever so slightly on the splinter of a wooden chess piece, has come up frighteningly unsightly today, aching and stinging, so that I am now worried I may have been infected. Perhaps when I slipped over in that disgusting mud, something got into the wound. The abrasion had evidently somehow opened again in my sleep, whether I bumped it on something during my restless tossing and turning. My sheets and pillowcases were stained by dark, bloody patterns, and on Tuesday morning I had to bandage my thumb right up, just to keep it from bleeding. I awoke not too late on Tuesday to the crowing of cocks. My city brain, adjusted to the noise of traffic and construction, was horrified and surprised by the morning bird calls and insects, and I couldn't get back to sleep once the first rooster cried out with its horrible masculine song of daybreak. To my surprise, as I walked out into my living room, half naked, adjusting my dressing gown, I was to find that I was not entirely alone. Fortunately, there was no one inside my living room, but I could hear a significant mumbling on my veranda and clinking glasses, confirming there were at least 2 people out there having some kind of volatile conversation. Making myself decent, I proceeded out of the door, where I found 3 rather ragged and rambunctious types making themselves quite comfortable on the furniture of my veranda. They were sharing wine and smoking rolled tobacco, and the anxiety came to roost. I recognized the girl immediately. It was Phoebe, the slightly mad, wild-spirited girl I had had the warped privilege of meeting last night. There was also another young woman, pale and skinny, with mousy blonde hair and dark circles under her eyes. She was chuckling with a nasal, highly strung laugh. The third unexpected guest was a male with a dark Manson-like complexion. His long, dark brown hair was stringy and unkempt, and he wore a purple bandana with yellow stars across it over his brow. His facial hair was sparse and wiry, and there was a certain vacant look in his eyes. He was wearing yellow flip-flops. "It isn't a little early to be drinking wine?" I asked incredulously. The 3 continued chatting and joking as if I wasn't there. For a moment I felt I may have died and gone invisible like so many ghosts I'd read about in my years of absorbing tacky horror fiction. Finally, Phoebe turned her head slowly, laughing and acknowledging me. "It's 10:30. Isn't it a little late to be getting out of bed?" Flustered, I checked my phone. Had I really slept in so late? I guess the roosters hadn't been the early risers that I'd imagined. Well, Monday night had been rather exhausting. The mousy-haired girl looked up at me now, too, through bloodshot, cynical eyes. "We were beginning to think you'd done a runner, skipped town, scared off by the welcome party." I looked at her and raised an eyebrow or two. "You mean those black Land Rovers, don't you?" I meant to ask her who were they. Phoebe looked up at me mockingly. After our awkward conversation the night before, we had eventually been shocked by a surprise welcome party of black cars, who had loitered around with their searchlights pointed at the house. "Oh, that's just the night watch. I wouldn't worry about them. The people in this town have an obsession with security, making sure the town is safe from wild animals and what have you." "You're a murder writer, ain't you?" said the dark-haired man whose name I was to learn was David. "I'm investigating the skinning of Jeremy Scarborough," I said. The other girl's name was Nora. After some puerile conversations, the group offered to show me around town and introduce me to the locals. So that's how it started. That's how I found myself rolling through Bishop's Head in Nora's busted-up, old and decrepit brown ute. First, they'd driven me up to the top of the tallest hill, up the steep ascent of Dingo Road, the old engine screaming with glee as it struggled upwards. Then we all got out, overlooking the homesteads and paddocks below. We ambled forward. I noted a grand old homestead on the hill behind us. The town seemed quite serene from up on that hill, hardly sinister at all. Phoebe had opened up another bottle of wine. I tried to turn down another glass, but she had a very persuasive way of winking and sticking out her tongue as she poured. The death of the skinned man seemed to waft through the stifling air. There was a stillness to the valley, a hot morning stillness. There was no sound at all up on the mountain. Down on the main roads I could see some kind of action. Cars, people. There seemed to be a whole lot of cars parked in a half-assed fashion around the paddock near Prime Street, as if there was a local fair or fete happening. There was an eagle flying high above, pivoting in the high-altitude winds of the tall, open Australian sky. Davo turned to me now, looking at me suspiciously with his dark eyes. He seemed as if he was trying to open me up, like a book, wanting to read inside me. "Do you think he's ready?" he finally said, cryptically to the two girls. "Shut up, Reese," said Phoebe. "You know what? You're just bitter. You're angry at yourself you can't even enjoy this peaceful view of the country without looking up and seeing an illusory sky." Davo tilted his head sarcastically. "Well, whatever, I didn't say anything. There isn't even a chemtrail. Look, as far as the eye can see. Not this morning. God's just waking up." I was beginning to find Davo mildly irritating, especially in light of the grim nature of my business. Nora began to twirl around. Her tie-dyed dress created colourful patterns as she twirled, like a whirling dervish. "What time are we going to get high? I think I can see some mushrooms down in the field there." "No, not doing mushrooms again after what happened with Davo last time," Phoebe interjected. I listened as the three friends engaged in what I gathered was a typical conversation of theirs, covering a myriad of incestuous ideas, psychedelic drugs, fractal patterns, hallucination versus reality, chemistry, human biology, early philosophy, the ancient religions, secret meeting places of well-known scientists, artists, and astronomers of the Enlightenment, black holes, Stephen Hawking as portrayed by Eddie Redmayne, Faust. I found myself intrigued by some of the more intelligent arguments, but was unable to interrupt, remaining a passive observer, trying not to drink, but somehow succumbing to the inebriating pleasure of it. Finally, we got back in the car, as Phoebe suggested again that it was time to go uptown and meet some locals. My three guides fell strangely silent on the way back down Dingo Road, and I sensed a nervousness in them, which seemed uncharacteristic. The landscape became oppressive again too, as we sunk back below the horizon line and the daunting purple mountains on either side which formed Bishop's Valley, swallowing us like alien lips, our engine groaning like a weary torture victim. The harsh bracken foliage of the bush along the road seemed to hate with the entire history of evolution in the stark sunlight. For the first time I found myself drinking the blood-red wine, not to belong, but to escape the mere callousness of the daylight. After driving through the spattering of homesteads, we were soon back along the old stone road, amidst the paddocks and leering animals, making our way back to Prime Street, where I could already see the formations of cars closing off the few precarious and only shops. Nora and Phoebe exchanged an ominous glance which I couldn't quite read. Soon we were pulling over by the side of the road. I could see 5 stony-faced men standing near the corner store. They didn't turn their heads, but somehow I got the feeling they knew we were coming. As the doors were unlocked in sequence, they finally turned to watch. 3 of the men were wearing oddly styled American sunglasses. One stood out, a carved, weathered face with a dark brown akubra perched slyly over his eyes. The men stared, necks like emus, as we exited the cars and walked towards them. Phoebe had whispered softly in my ear as we got out. "The guy in the akubra is Banjo Wilson. He basically runs the town. A lot of the other men call him Dingo because he lives in that homestead up on Dingo Road, the one we just saw. The guy with the mullet is Bruce. He owns the corner store." As I examined the 2 men Phoebe had pointed out, I felt an uneasiness about their appearance, about them generally. Bruce was a balding, pale, incommunicative, sweaty man with khaki trousers and suspenders. Banjo Wilson's face was still obscured by the shadow of his hat, so I couldn't quite analyze him. There seemed to be hundreds of flies swooping about the men's faces. Banjo's hat had little corkstrings running off it to ward off the flies. As we moved closer, Dingo's face finally flipped up, so you could see his piercing eyes bulging dark like the eyes of a galahs. "Well then, look at these bludgers!" said Banjo in a dry country accent. You mob look like blackfellas who just lost their land. I see you got yourself another rad bag for your daily layabouts. Banjo stared at me now, looking me up and down like a butcher sizing up the amount of good meat on a slab of cow. The balding shopkeeper walked towards Phoebe with a lustful expression on his face, the flies teetering around his lopsided eye. You do look like a pack of abos, don't ya? Bruce said. Pissed already this early in the morning. You must be bored shitless. Why don't you do something productive, you Darrow bastards? I've got some bales you can lift if you want some honest work. You're going to teach this new sponge how to coast through life too? Don't be a douchebag, Bruce. We're showing Flynn around town. Besides, you all got some nerve standing around all day like you do. Two of the men with the sunglasses began eyeballing me now, as if they were mentally writing up a report in their minds. Banjo leered and moved towards, standing over me. What's wrong with your pet cat anyway? Ain't he got a tongue of his own? I was brought up with the dictum speak when spoken to, I said cordially. I know who you are, Banjo replied menacingly. VanDeBerg, ain't you? Welcome to Bishop's Head, mate. You're a long way from Holland now. I'm sorry, I said questioningly. That's a Dutch name, VanDeBerg. You know what it means in the old language. From up on the hill. It's true. Got some Dutch ancestors myself. Fitting for the situation, though. Welcome to the valley, boy. With this, the abrasive Banjo and two of his men pushed by me, intentionally moving away from us in a threatening display of disapproval, elbowing me in the chin as they went. I looked at Phoebe, clasping my chin in pain, trying to analyze what it all meant. She just smiled and shrugged. Come on, she said. Let's grab some cokes and whiskey. Our group followed her into the corner store as an impudent Bruce followed behind us. Don't steal nothing, you dumb blacks, he muttered as we entered the shop. We'd spent an unnaturally long time in the store, and it was only now, as I finally began to get a sense of the people here, that I realized I had entered what was casually referred to as valley time by the group. Country time, that is. The days were long in Bishop's Valley, and rather than struggling to fill up the hours, my companions padded out their days, allowing each moment to be consuming. Everything took longer than it did in the city. Everything hung heavily. Bruce had muttered some more racist expletives as we finally brought our supplies and left, calling us damned coons and worse things. There were less of the loitering men now, and some of the families from the village had come up to do their shopping. The children that scattered around our feet were all Aryan kids, bleached white hair, skin tanned dark from the sun, skin damaged and dry, coated in freckles, missing teeth some. As we drove back to Phoebe and Nora's place, I was feeling quite tipsy and flushed in the face. My infected thumb was throbbing and aching underneath the bandage. Phoebe and Nora were discussing the etiquette of various highs and how to enhance their particular drugs, while Davo interrupted every now and again to say that the importance was more the meaning one garnered from the psychedelic experience, not the mindless inebriation. I was mostly quiet throughout until Phoebe finally probed me. What's your stance on drugs, Flynn? Which I thought about and quickly replied as the car pulled up to their large house. I don't see any problem at all with altering the chemicals in your body, so long as you're smart about it. Drugs are medicine if used wisely. That's very lucky you feel that way, said Nora slyly, considering. I'd only seen the group's house from a distance until now, and marvelled slightly at the sight of it. It was a creepy old building, though dilapidated. It was evidently not always used as a residential property. I would later hear the group mention that the building was once used as a hospital. The front facade of the building was high, with symmetrical 9-panelled windows. As we entered the large double doors, which weren't locked, we moved into the inner hall, where I was surprised by the coldness kept in by the old timber floors and walls. I can't really describe my feelings as I entered the strange lodgings. Before I even saw all the curious art in the long ward-like hallway, I felt a kind of surge of creative energy. In some part, I'm sure I was feeding off my companions, evidently excited to get home, having a certain buzz about them. They somehow seemed more alive than most people I encountered in life. They had launched into a passionate diatribe about the relevance of Marxism in the 21st century. I began joining in the conversations more now, offering my own opinions and tangent thread topics. I found an immediate bond with Rifa the moment I saw his grotesque artworks in the hall. They depicted strange, surrealist nightmares, Bosch-like scenes of hellish chaos, and yet there was nothing supernatural about the varied, populated landscapes. Rather, they depicted intricate insect and plant life, Australian animals exaggerated to embellish, with emotional realism, the terrible qualities which nature had endowed them. "Pretty good, eh?" he bragged without arrogance. They were fascinatingly grotesque. I began to discuss art and aesthetics with Davo as the wine kept flowing, and generous glasses of Scotch whisky were also poured. Inevitably, the topic of the tarot cards I was developing came up. I mentioned the talented artists I was working with for the project, and the group displayed an enthusiasm to see the draft images, so I said I would quickly slink home to grab them. On the way out, the shroud of familiarity suddenly left me, and I realized how dependent I was becoming on my new friends for companionship, the murder still haunting my mind. I had an awful feeling about the muddy rainbow curtains of their house as I left. There was a horrible ugliness and depth to them, a sickening pattern on them like fractals, which put me ill at ease on the short inebriated walk back to my house. It was sundown again, my second evening in Bishop's Valley, and yet in spite of a growing sense of familiarity, there was an indescribable offness lurking behind my feelings. Something felt unfathomably wrong with everything. There was a sinking dampness to the old lime-colored house as I strode across the creaking floorboards, picking up the brown paper bag which the dummy cards were wrapped in, then retreating to the deck to retrieve the 2 spares which I had used as a bookmark earlier. I made my way sullenly back to Crow Street as the grey of dusk swept over everything. On the way back, I noticed a great old wooden canoe strung up on the side of the group's house. I mentioned it later to Phoebe when we were alone, which is where the idea of night canoeing had developed. When I returned to the main hall, my companions were all crowded around a large stone table waiting for me to bring the tarot cards. I could smell the marijuana and noted that Davo was busily chopping up some bud. The group were all very interested in the deck I was working on, and I saw it as a favourable opportunity to run through it again myself, before the final artwork commenced this week. I laid out all the paper cards, separating them into 2 piles, the minor arcana and the major arcana. My new friends were at least competent enough with the subject matter I didn't need to explain the basics. Davo was impressed by the sketches so far and appeared to take a new liking to me. I found it curious that the group was drawn quickly towards the 2 arcana I had used as a bookmark, Judgment and the Milky Way. For some reason this fact stayed with me. I tried my best not to discuss the murder, trying not to bring a morbid tone to the conversation. Of course they wanted to know why I had chosen opals as one of the suits of the minor arcana, which triggered my drunken explanation that replacing pentacles with the iconic Australian precious stone reconnected the card of gain symbolically with the earth, showing the practical aspect of money and the general prosperity of our native lands. Davo particularly liked some of the artwork on the major arcana, picking up the Gateway, depicting a black open abyss of stars, the Convict, depicting an early Australian convict stepping off the boat, the Outback, the Skyscraper, the Rainbow Serpent, the Pointer of the Bone, the Corroboree, the Old Hangman, the Unlucky Bushman, which showed a ragged bushman wandering like a fool down a wayward bush path. The Outback card and the Skyscraper card somehow triggered a rather rowdy conversation about the Australian identity, but in my inebriated confidence I soon had managed to lead the conversation back to the tarot, as Dave and I exchanged heated but enlivened words. The symbolism of the tarot was only invented in the modern world. That's not entirely true. Martiano di Tortana mentions picture cards as early as the year 1418. It shows a deck with 16 picture cards, which images the Greek gods and suits depicting 4 kinds of birds, which proves that the tarot has an older origin, tied to more ancient mythologies. That's rubbish. You've been watching too much Zeitgeist. Digeblin created the entire notion of the mystical tarot. I completely disagree. Anton Kurt Digeblin was very articulate. If you actually read his chapter on the tarot in Le Monde Primitif, you would be able to deny the man was merely observing something which already existed. In any case, it matters none. Even if he had invented the entire thing, the fact that its meaning has endured is enough to prove there is something to it. You're not seriously telling me you believe the evolution of the tarot has its roots in the Egyptian practitioners who worship Thoth? I'm just saying, blame Atilia if you wish to scoff at the practice of tarot divination. Digeblin knew his stuff. So why make a new deck? Is there some inherited wisdom from ancient religions that somehow miraculously passed hands into the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, then Crowley's Toss deck? Surely that wisdom shouldn't be found in the images produced beyond the aeon of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Surely you're only watering down the meaning by filling it with Australian cliches. Not so, not so. The occult is a moving force behind the scenes. It has to adapt to remain true as the world changes. The girls, meanwhile, had somewhat fallen out of our argument, lost interest, but Davo and I had beaten each other's skepticism, launching now into a fascinating drunken debate from topics like telema to quantum physics. We discussed the late Cambrian period of evolution, where vast experimentation of the forms of organisms were at a height, and how this suggests the creative mind behind the universe. We discussed patterns in nature having a meaning like the tarot, and how the first Australians could read the marks in rocks, and this mystical shamanism was being the earliest form of language. I don't understand your meaning with that one. I mean, we live in a neo-Darwinist world where all of science is devoted to proving that life is a process of randomness. I yelled over-enthusiastically. Davo agreed. The order in nature reveals itself more and more every day. Nature is filled with function and meaning of intellect. The morphogenesis in the late Cambrian period displays a creative nature at play. People found Lamarckian evolution ridiculous last century, and yet now Lamarck is coming back into fashion. Maybe Darwin only saw part of the picture. Exactly. Haeckel's Radalarians. As Davo spoke now, he no longer seemed like the crusty hippie I had first spotted on my balcony. There was something exciting inside him, a kind of late 1800s German romanticism, with his waves of glossy hair, full beard, and the distant gaze of a dreamer. Look at Haeckel's Medusae jellyfish. Those drawings practically started an art movement, science holding hands with art, the flowing forms and tentacles of Art Nouveau. Nature was allowed meaning, pattern. Well, you know, Haeckel was an admirer of ghosts. He believed there was an artistic soul in all living things. He believed adamantly in a creative, organized force that pervaded nature. Nora finally butted into our conversation here. Haeckel appeared to pseudo-intellectuals. He probably aided the social Darwinism that Adolf Hitler championed, but beyond even that, his observations are just bad. There's too much symmetry in his drawings. His bats look like Rorschach blots. There is symmetry and delicacy in nature. Look how termites build their cathedrals in the clay. Conical spires that can soar up to 6 or 7 meters. An intricate network of tunnels and chambers that include nurseries, air vents, gardens for growing fungal food, and a royal palace. The termite cities would be 1,000 meters high on a human scale and look like the Tower of Babel. Well, if you want to see nature's strangest mysteries, you need only look at the mangroves down by the river. With this last comment, the group suddenly grew strangely quiet. I noticed the 3 others staring at each other with panic and dread, almost a kind of table talk, speaking with their eyes. Nora and David then stood up. I need to speak to you for a second, Nora. The 2 of them awkwardly excused themselves. This was when I had mentioned the canoe to Phoebe. She stood up and walked with me into the kitchen. As the others disappeared into another room, she seemed engaged at first, suggesting we should go down and take the canoe out on the river now. I was significantly inebriated. That my caution abandoned, the idea seemed reasonable. Then she had suggested that I go and pull the canoe down and get it ready near the broad path behind the house, while she got changed. Then she'd come out and meet me. I approved of the idea, even sensing a slight romantic inclination behind all of this. Don't be too long, I said, pouring myself a glass of wine for the walk. It had taken a small amount of time to unleash the thick wet ropes and untangle the various knots, keeping the canoe grafted on the wall. It slipped once and I got the rope loose, the heavy bulk frame almost crushing me. Still, I managed to slowly lower it, then begin to heave the thing, slowly dragging it through the mud and grass along the side of the house. The saline puddles stunk of fermenting salt even on the lawn. As I pulled the canoe to the back of Phoebe's garden, I could hear the wind blowing wildly through the estuary. There were even sparse mangroves near the mouth of the path. The terrible stench wafted up. The path was much closer to the water than the one in my own yard. The spikes sticking up through the dirt stuck into my feet. There was a wet crunch as the mangrove stalks broke underfoot, a loud squelching. I stopped when I reached the path. After 10 minutes of cricket and cicada noises, finishing my glass of wine, I began to wonder what was taking Phoebe so long. As I waited at the canoe, I wandered back, leaving the stench and the canoe, at the very least to grab another glass of red wine. There was an unusual quiet back in the house. Had everyone gone to bed, I wondered. Were they all playing a trick on me? I walked slowly down the hallway, sticking my ear out to try and hear better. I felt a cold energy, a quiet pessimism lingering like a rumbling terror. Suddenly, tiptoeing from uneasiness, I thought I heard a faint tap or clatter. There were 8 doors in the hallway, so I focused, trying to determine which room the noise was coming from. Touching the cold wood of the doors one by one, I wandered further down. Then I heard the soft moaning. It was Phoebe's voice. Not quite with pain, not quite with pleasure. A low, barely audible moan. The floor creaked beneath my feet. Finally, amidst the darkness, I narrowed in on the sound. I don't know what possessed me to push open the 3rd door on the left. For all I knew, Phoebe and Nora even, could have been sharing a private moment. Hell, even Phoebe on her own. I guess, in some ways, she was. I hadn't seen the bedroom of the guy's house before. I guess I just assumed from the size of the place certain things about the way they lived. The lack of furniture in the hall hadn't made me think they lived roughly. But now I began to gather the truth. Phoebe lay against the wall on a dingy yellow-stained mattress. The room was mostly bare except for some pop culture posters on the walls and some dilapidated-looking furniture. The paint on the walls was peeling. There was a used syringe on the carpet next to her. From her vacant eyes, I knew she had injected. The neon light showed up all the marks on her arms I'd failed to notice previously. The strange birthmark on her neck was bleeding too, but I didn't think much of it. She couldn't see me at all. She was too far gone. Everything was clear to me now. Everything made sense. All the weird conversations, their manic mood swings. Heroin. They were junkies. Disillusioned and disappointed, I had to go somewhere for a minute, have some time to think. I decided to haul it out on the canoe alone. In a sort of inebriated fury, I charged down the sandy, mangrove-ridden slope, pulling the canoe behind me. Before long, I had reached the water and pushed off, leaping aboard. I coasted down the Black River. It was dark on the water. I could barely make out anything except the stars. There were some disorientating shapes among the trees on the other side of the river, black shadows skiving about. I lay back, keeping the paddles hanging close to steer, but didn't paddle. I just let the canoe float along the lapping surface. The dripping sound almost gave me a momentary sense of peace. Finally, as the canoe slowed and sat fairly still, I pulled the oars in completely. I shut my eyes for just a brief moment. Then, hugging the side of the boat and staring at my reflection in the moonlight reflecting upon the water, I let out a little sob. The pessimism in my heart grew, and as I thought over the day, and all the winding dead ends and red herrings life brings, I became mortally depressed to think that I had actually been so enraptured earlier in the evening, talking mystic bullshit with a bunch of junkies. I doubted all meaning. All existence was chaos after all. Life grew, then was left to rot and fester, to slowly die in some stench-ridden hole, like this mangrove-infested river. I was slowly sobering up as the canoe turned on its axis axis ever so slowly. I must have been staring at the white splotch for a long time. It was slowly growing in girth beneath the dark water. It hadn't registered. It wasn't until the object had risen so much it had formed a kind of blurry Y shape. Then I began to question what it was. Finally I became more alert, arching my back as the thing ascended. It was something large, something organic, complex, perhaps an animal, a shark? Then it flipped over and I saw it clearly for the first time. The flesh was pale, whiter than plaster. It had no hair, but the body had not yet completely rotted either. Its features were clearly discernible: eyes, nose, mouth. Human. The expression on its face was one of utter terror. Though the body was clearly dead, its rotting flesh, peeling and sodden, water-logged eyeballs bulging out of its face. Its facial expression seemed to offer up a warning, like the ghost of Hamlet's father. "Flee this place!"
The Mangroves of Bishop's Valley, Chapter 3, The Pointer of the Bone. Black. My thumb has turned black. Where is it all heading? All this torment, this damn blood-clogged, pulsating wound. Goddamn itchy sores. Wednesday morning was hell. Absolute hell. I went to sleep late on Tuesday after the haunting image of the corpse beneath the canoe. I returned to my own bed, barely able to sleep. Terrible dreams. Tossing and turning all night, with a sharp pain in my thumb and hand from whatever infection that accursed splintered chess piece has given me. Then I was woken early by incessant country bird calls. To top it all off, I threw up in the toilet after getting out of my bed. It must have been all the alcohol and cigarettes. My throat was filled with bile and flecks of chunder. I took the bandage off to take a shower. The tip of my thumb was all soggy and soft, and the entire thumbnail ripped loose as I peeled it off, oozing pus. Then I changed into fitting black clothes. There was a morning dew as I walked outside. The blades of grass stuck up like little daggers. Nothing was inviting me to go outside. I didn't want to run into Phoebe, Nora, or Davo, or anyone else from the town. I had planned to spend the day in the library, studying, and the quicker I got there, the better. The country air, which had seemed so fresh my first day here, was now becoming stifling, hot, and thick. The chaos of nature was no longer beautiful either. It was planned anarchy, malicious disorder. In the patchy grass and twig-laden path that led to my car, I saw cultivated devilry. I saw old age and death everywhere I looked. The car engine didn't want to start. Morning frost had choked it. It coughed and spluttered like it had been smoking all night with the rest of us. As my car reversed, the lime-colored residence didn't look like a house. It was a construct, a ragged shelter. All the parts were there, yes, but they were non-uniform. Planks of wood, corrugated iron, loosely piled together. Then, back on the road, if you could call it a road, the loose gravel, the wheels slipping. Oh, heavens! I knew the library was only a 5-minute drive on the north far side of town, the edge of the bush. The residential roads winded out past the paddocks. Then there was a dingy red dirt road leading off to the right before the start of Prime Street. The wheels of my car kicked up little rocks. Barbed wire hung loosely from hand-cut wooden posts by the side of the road. A flock of currawong were flying serenely above the treetops. Their melancholy three-tone song heralded entropy. The library didn't open until 9 o'clock. I sat in my car staring uncomfortably at the closed sign on the library door for 20 minutes. The town was wholly dead. I could hear the librarian's car, probably from the moment she left her house, winding around the country roads. Joy almost crept back into my face as the silver BMW pulled into the car yard. I observed the woman as she got out, hoping she wouldn't notice me, not wanting to seem like the desperate early morning customer. She didn't seem to notice my car at all, pulling herself tiredly but elegantly from her car. The woman had short, shoulder-length ginger hair, somehow sultry looking. She wore a kind of 1980s woman's power suit, with matching skirt and jacket. Her legs were pale and blistered, but still attractive. She seemed to mutter to herself grumpily, as she exhibited her keys and unlocked the main door of the library. I waited for another 10 minutes before entering the building. The automatic doors had an early Art Deco quality as they swung open, revealing an immense interior. Green lamps and red mahogany, gold trimmings, felted shelves, splotchy carpet. Most impressive were the shelves filled with wonderful old books, stockpiled rows of multiple levels. Hard to believe there was a grand old library like this in such an obscure rural outpost. The woman almost leapt with surprise when I entered, confounded perhaps by having a customer at all, let alone at this hour. Welcome, she said, emphatically. New to town? I smiled at her sincerely and approached the rustic old wooden bench she was behind. Yes, I'm only 2 days here, I said. I'm here on business. Would you like to open an account? She asked. Well, I'll probably spend the day here researching. You might do me a favor and show me the books on the local region. I'm studying the area, particularly the indigenous population. Then again, I may well borrow books later this evening. Perhaps I had better set up an account. The woman moved purposefully, conquering exhaustion. She pulled a clipboard from beneath the desk and began typing something on her keyboard. She handed me a pen. Just fill this out, and I'll get your card ready. Your name? Flynn VanDeBerg. Address? Number 7, Livestock Circuit. The woman busied herself with a shoebox full of plastic cards as I filled in the form. Well, it's lovely to meet you, Flynn. We don't get many visitors at all here, I'm afraid. Actually, this is the first membership card I've ever processed. I laughed. That's not a joke. I'm Chelsea, by the way, she continued. I'm living in Upper Bodie at the moment. Mind you, I'm hardly a local either. I was transferred here. See, I was out of work for a long time, and a company offered me, well, boring you with my life story. The girl blushed. Nonsense. Tell me, what was the name of the company that sent you here? Mine is indeed a similar story. Red Seal Recruit. Never heard of them. Not the same company as me. I suppose they have a shortage of skilled workers in the area. Yes, I suppose so, said the librarian, with a morose and fearful tone. The locals have a very strange way down this way. To tell you the truth, you're the first person who has seemed normal to me. I've been here for almost 3 months now. I don't think anyone in the area wants to maintain the library at all. They seem to have no care whatsoever for art, culture, books, or the humanities. Yet it's obvious the population once had great reverence for heritage and knowledge. Why else would they build and foster such a wonderful old library, in the first place? Yes, I said, not knowing quite what to say. Well, she said, handing me a card. This is your card. You can begin borrowing straight away. You can find the local section on the second level, up the back. Thank you, Chelsea, I said gratefully, nodding my head and bowing slightly, almost weirdly. There was an eerie quality to the library. The librarian's description of her role here hadn't diminished the feeling in any way. I imagined her trying to sweep the dust off the books, day in, day out. No management, no visitors. It was more like a cemetery than a library. The unread, leather-bound old books were like tombstones to a dead culture. The quiet was unbearable. I even missed the hideous bird songs outside. I began to scan some of the books on level 1. I was amazed at the age of the stock. There couldn't have been a book on the shelves later than the 1970s. Most were at least 100 years old. There was a terrible musty smell. All the old covers had a slightly damp quality, and the pages were yellowing. There were even cobwebs in certain corners of the corridors, like a cliché Gothic setting in a modern adaptation of Edgar Allan Poe, or the set of an early Tim Burton film. The air, too, in the library had a revolting aspect. There seemed to be specks floating in the air everywhere one looked. It was almost difficult to breathe, asthmatic. The air was porous, filled with tiny little spores full of floaters, and an old book smell to the power of 1,000. Absorbed in the mucky old books, a hygienist's and germaphobe's nightmare, but an antiquarian's dream, I didn't hear Chelsea the librarian call out to me, so that when she peeked her head around the corner, I almost leapt in fright, I confess. "You know," she said nervously, "that wasn't the whole truth. The company I work for, they basically sent me here to clean up the place. Pack up the stock slowly. I believe they intend to shut down the library. They'll sell the stock to private owners. Maybe even destroy it. It's such a shame to see." I stared, speechless. Well, what I'm trying to say is, if you see any books you think you could find a place for, you might as well just take them, to be honest. The real truth is, I'd rather see them go to someone who actually appreciates books than, well, the alternative. Don't tell anyone I said so, of course. Well, thank you, Chelsea. I shall definitely keep it in mind. Chelsea disappeared behind the black counter. Now, that was some incentive. I knew in Sydney or online some of these books could be sold for high prices given their age and rarity. Of course, that was probably exactly what the company intended to do with the stock, and I didn't want to be so cynical as to steal merely for my own monetary gain. But even merely as a book lover, I would die to get my hands on some magnificent books such as the ones that I was seeing. Most book scouting is of course done online these days. The only reason one can't rely on the internet is in the case of rare books and books that are out of print. In these cases, I usually use a specialist search program called Hades Underworld. It's a book-finding portal that's constantly updated by the best libraries and private collectors in the world, and charts just about all the stock inventory from every country, contacting all independent publishing companies and even solo print shops. If there's a book you can't find on the HU portal, it must be extremely obscure. But sometimes, even when you track down a rare book, the only way to read it is to travel to an obscure location or contact a private dealer directly, in many cases. I know from the portal that this library was chock-a-block with rare collections, one-offs in many cases. I have a habit at the library, one which often gets me disgruntled looks from library staff and the general public. It's kind of a 3-stage process. First off, I conquer that daunting barrier one feels when overloaded with choice. I walk to the relevant section, pulling out every book title that slightly intrigues me, piling them on a nearby table. Then I find I have more mental space to really peruse and explore my haul. Some books I merely skim, some I put in a borrow pile, some I note chapters for reference. Then finally I borrow. As Chelsea was so nice, normally I might feel terrible making a mess of the library, which she inevitably would have to clean up and tediously re-shelve. But in this instance, I knew she would probably just be dumping the books I rejected straight into crates, and thus I felt completely at ease. I perused some of the history books on level 1 before heading to the local shelves on level 2, where I began to start my collection. There was a large study table by the ladder, so I soon made it my base, covering it in large leather-bound volumes. Curiously, many of the very old books didn't even have a text on the spines, so it required a lot of investigation. Some were merely marked with gold leaf iconography. With great intrigue, I grabbed quite early in the game a centuries-old black book marked with a gold chess bishop, storing it for later inspection. But greater was my surprise when I uncovered an old tome with an image adorned that was all the more terrifying to me. The leather spine was engraved with a deep red image of curious familiarity. 2 parallel lines with tapered ends, sidelined by 2 9 or 6-shaped arms. I pulled the heavy book down and put it on my study desk. I set to work thoroughly, examining the shelf, standing on the little gold ladder whenever necessary to peek under the highest insets. In my robotic, obsessive way, I had soon retrieved a large stack of books on the subject of local history, as well as a treasure trove of local and national indigenous culture and history. I was awed by the archaic and in many cases politically incorrect titles. Men Who Built the Nation, The Danger of Mungo Man, Exterminating the Australoid. But moreover, that these titles were mixed with intellectually stimulating and challenging titles, such as Hidden Forces in the Ecosystem, Darwin versus the Shaman, and curious occult titles. The Aboriginal Black Mass, The Secret of the Mangroves, Black Magic in Bishop's Head, LSD in the Animal Kingdom, and ESP, Plants and Hallucinogens. After stockpiling hundreds of books around me, I finally began stage 2 of the process. I dove into the more mundane aspects of history first, skimming many books on the area, noting only interesting tidbits I wasn't aware of. There was nothing outstanding except some great photographs and facts about the Shadow King, that is the mural on the south end of town, which I mentioned desiring to see earlier. Actually, the book set in motion more desire to see other cave paintings in the valley, for the range of shamanistic art I saw now astounded me. I knew that the Warwol people were a unique example, and that they may yet prove that the generation of human culture and religion had its roots right here in Australia, with the indigenous shamanistic acts of engaging with their cosmic psychological force, which began over 40,000 years ago. I became utterly intrigued with this theme, reading next a fairly thick modern volume entitled A Thorough History of the Warwol People. The title page intrigued me. It was a watercolor painting by Namatjira, depicting an outback landscape with an Aboriginal man standing with his legs wide apart, holding a bone up in the air at a brightly colored, painterly dotted sun. The title page was labeled The Pointer of the Bone by Albert Namatjira. Obviously, I was familiar with the pointing of the bone ritual. I had named one of my major arcana after it in my tarot deck. But it was interesting to read particularly about the Warwol people of this region and their own practice in this regard. Like many indigenous societies, the Warwol tribes often elected a Kodecha, a magic man, who among many ritualistic and shamanistic tasks was appointed as the tribal executioner. A role that would be called into play against lawbreakers as well as offending neighborhood tribes. Due to certain superstitions, the Warwol did not always commit the standard execution by spear in their penal system, believing that with certain rituals, nature would carry out justice for them. The pointing of the bone ritual, known well in modern Australia, from when it was used notoriously against former Prime Minister John Howard towards the end of last century, traditionally marked the victim for unnatural death. The Kodecha would wear ceremonial gear made of human hair, cockatoo, and emu feathers, then would point a piece of femur bone at the offender, whereby it was believed the accused would shortly thereafter die from the Dreamtime curse delivered. Claims of hundreds dying from bone-pointing ceremonies were recorded by indigenous folk and early European settlers, alongside tales that the death was painful and that the victim may live unhappily for several weeks after the ritual, before his inevitable death. My interest in the pointing of the bone ritual in my tarot set had merely been to replace the Grim Reaper, a very medieval European icon of death, with a more Australian symbol. I now found myself reading more into certain testimonies surrounding Aboriginal omens than I normally might have done. The first anecdote from oral history which disturbed me somewhat was the local superstition that the accidental exposure to a dead body could be viewed as a bad omen. My thoughts jumped frantically back to the pale corpse I had seen floating aimlessly in Greengills River last night. But then even more startling stories revolving around the Mangroves began to capture my anxious attention. The Warwol people, it seemed, had a long-standing fear and reverence for the Mangroves in the thousands of years they had inhabited the region. Early folk legends and Dreamtime stories all reference an unhallowed presence among the Mangroves of the valley. Some myths told stories of negative Dreamtime spirits, whilst others spoke of a more unnameable unholiness and emanating darkness. An earlier settler, John Rathbone, made varying accounts of his companions' testimonies. More than a dozen separate individuals reported there was something evil living near or in the Mangroves. An odd recurring theme. Aboriginal superstitions are hard to measure. I read in the historical accounts many confusing references in relation to the Mangroves of the Kitiri. My futile attempts to translate this term only came up with abstract notions. which I interpret as the skin takers, or the ones inside the skin. It seems to be well documented that the practice of animal sacrifice was common with the Warrior. The Mangroves seem to have been involved, but I would assume this may have been some attempt to appease whatever negative spirits the tribe believed inhabited the place. The reports of human sacrifices to me seem fabricated. I would put this down to colonial racism, as it has been well documented that European Christians exaggerated violent practices of the black population to substantiate their own doctrines. The book indeed presented the case that the Warrior tribe had a uniquely defensive culture. Their corroborees, dreamtime dances, and theatrics all tie in with an almost paranoid military campaign of spiritual defense. It's probable that they read their warnings in the stars, as astrological portents are mixed with chemical recipes and potions for the dead, and all other cultural practices are intertwined with their various artworks. The tribe had reverence for the emu in the sky, which corresponds to a dark nebula near the 3 dots of Orion's belt, which, apparently, represent 3 brothers fishing in a canoe beneath the emu spirit. It is known that the Aboriginals were using canoes since at least 1640, that they may have traveled to Valley by canoe, and that this constellation remained a significant monument to their cultural traditions since their arrival. The books on tribal lore point to a rather complex map of interrelated spiritual belief spread out across their sacred sites, hills, rocks, trees, waterholes, all orchestrated around the prevention of some supposed evil emanating from the Mangroves. I might assume this had something to do with the death of their ancestors here. Who can know for certain, with thousands of years of unrecorded history? The Warrior dreaming beliefs were similar to other tribes, having a basic explanation of reality with ongoing phenomenon happening constantly in the dream time alongside the real world. Intertwined stories incorporating the past, the present, and the future. Their primary deity seems to have some ancestry with the more well-known sky god, Balame. As I read the book, it began to strike me how much in common the king of the shadow painting had with Balame's Cave, a well-known national heritage site in Australia. Balame was a widespread god and sky father, or sky hero to some tribes. The Wanarua painting of Balame resembles the crown of the Shadow King in style, but moreover the thematic exploration indicates a similar movement happening amongst tribe members across the entire nation. In Dreamtime legends, it is told that Balame came down from the sky, creating the rivers, mountains, and forests. Then as humanity developed, he also gave people laws, traditions, songs, and culture. The Shadow King caves were male-only areas, just like the caves of Balame, and must have had some importance in male ritual. There is evidence of tribe members walking along their songlines between caves in preparation against something from the Mangroves. At certain times, the men had seemingly hidden inside the caves from an outside threat, with information passed from group to group via a message stick. I wonder if these stories hark back to the period when megafauna roamed the continent. It's well documented that the megafauna inhabited this area of Bishop's Valley, and it is commonly thought that the indigenous population hunted the giant beasts to extinction with their spears. Perhaps there were earlier ancestors on the valley, while species such as Procoptodon and Pelagostes were still here. That at least would justify the terror associated with the region. After a few more books on indigenous area, I searched some local history through a European lens. I soon came to the strange book with a gold bishop engraved on the cover, and opening it I discovered the onset title, History of Bishop's Head unto 1846. Here is an excerpt. Followers of thy Achaean Republic, which thy redcoats did bring at into creation through the drawing of blood, know ye the history of Bishop's Head conceals a vile secret. The book intriguingly begun. The Bishop's Head book seemed to be an early history of the town, written by founders or members of government. However, the tone itself suggested it was not written for public display, but merely for a private audience of initiated members of some facet of the Valley Council. From what I had read earlier, relations between the Aboriginals and the early settlers were relatively peaceable in the first years, as the sharing of cultural traditions and food seems evident. The settlers reported tasting bush tucker as barbecued goanna, witchetty grubs, and beefsteak fungus to appease the locals. The account in the Bishop's Head book, however, seemed to outline an entirely different account of interracial history. I wonder if it wasn't the annals of some kind of white supremacist group or colonial secret society. In any case, the book retained that white men have had no peaceable relationships with the blacks since the town was laid with stone. On one thing, the history books all agreed. Curious horror stories about Green Gills River and the outlying mangroves. One particular incident recounts the disappearance of one Frederick Fisher, an Irish settler who was supposedly trolling his boat out upon the estuary when he failed to return home. 4 months after Fisher vanished, witness testimonies say he returned unexpectedly, stumbling blindly into the Black Gum Hotel in Morrowvale, pale and shaken to his very bones. He told the assorted audience that he had just encountered something terrible down there in those mangroves, lost time in the Devil's Pit, and that he was spitting on back to Sydney, where there was still an honest boat to be found, far away from this damn swamp of madmen and devils. The men had tried to cajole young Fisher over a beer and get the story out of what had him so damn scared, but Fisher had drowned his schooner quickly, eager to be out on the road, afraid of something on the follow. Fisher was later found dead on the thruway, knocked dead by a truck, his brains splayed. But the tale was added to the folklore of the town, and the evil of the mangroves became a local legend. There are many more stories of men disappearing. However, the Bishop's Head tome put these stories mostly down to hysteria. Other curious stories surround the Red Den Roadhouse, an old RH out between Bishop's Valley and Opabody. Amid stories of dark happenings in the mangroves, there also seems to be a range of other occult sightings in the region, including a huge wave of UFO sightings around Opabody in the 1900s. Perhaps this merging of popular culture is what caused all the hype about the Roadhouse, particularly one event, 1908. Old Michael Crawford was said to have gone utterly mad one afternoon, turning up at the Roadhouse and yelling about how the town was being taken over. There only seems to be vague connections between the lights seen in the sky around Opabody, the fear of the townsfolk towards the mangroves, and the growing feeling of paranoia about a foreign power influencing, absorbing local affairs, which may have been put all down to anti-Semitism. In any case, there are indeed many references to the protesting against a foreign-run council since at least the 1800s. The Bishop book became rather vague and uninsightful. However, I was entranced by some odd memos and affiliate stamps towards the back. For one, there was a 2-page donation notice for the notorious Blue Boys, the private local law enforcement agency I had seen here on my first day. Those black Land Rovers and their insignia, which was a design of heraldry of local fauna with a crest and a shield. I was also surprised to see the familiar mark again, 2 parallel lines tapered at the ends with a 6 on either side. In remembrance, it occurred to me I had pulled a book from the shelves with that same insignia, the exact same symbol as the birthmark on Phoebe's neck. Below the sigil in the Bishop's book, there was a stamp and a date, and it was marked, "On the Order of the Red Seal." This was intriguing, and I knew that reading the book with the mark on it would help fill out some answers. But before reading it, I needed to find some more objective information on the Blue Boys and other networks which kept coming up repeatedly in my research. Another local history book proved useful on the subject. There were historical documents written by historians from neighboring towns which were less caught up in local biases. Night watch groups were common in the early formation of Australia, with rogue law enforcement groups keeping watch on their towns. According to Easy White's Lawmakers of the Outback, the Blue Boys were present in the valley as early as 1790. White charts the intermingling of different groups in the management of public affairs in the valley, noting the construction of a Freemasonic hall in Morovale in 1751. With a steady increase in Masonic politicians thereafter, he also notes a steady flux of Jewish migration in the 20th century. But White seems more concerned with the courtship between the financing of the Blue Boys and various groups in Sydney and Melbourne. Certain far-right groups were traced as maintaining ties with the Blue Boys in the earlier 1900s, such as the fascist New Guard, 5,000 or so of whom fled to Morovale when they were disbanded in Sydney in the late 1930s. Then there seems to be certain paranoid connections to American military and Secret Service groups of various affiliations. Wild notes that the CIA facility at Pine Gap, Northern Territory, created an outpost in Upper Body in the 1950s, and that complaints about a strong CIA presence in the valley were kept out of the mainstream press. The idea that CIA agents were passing to and from Morovale and the Pine Gap facility must have created an understandable paranoia among the townsfolk in the 1950s. However, there is no way to validate this claim without seeing declassified CIA files. The AFP seems to have had a marked presence in the town from the 1970s onwards. I soon opened the book with the curious mark Phoebe had on her neck. The inner title page contained the same sigil and was titled Documentation on the Order of the Red Seal, 1790 to 1899, Bishop's Head. I skimmed the book to get the idea. It was filled with barely annotated maps, reference pages, and reports, obviously not published for public consumption. Many of the reports seemed to log the shipment and freight of large unidentified shipping containers in and out of Bishop's Head. There are also military-like records of the movement of personnel. Curiously, some of the employee names listed were clearly Orthodox clergy, I'd guess Catholic, with titles like Cardinal Purley and Archbishop Legrand, Personnel 5887. I had trouble making sense of the data in the book of the Red Seal until I managed to match some facts with local press clippings. The name Haziah Honey became of particular significance. The name Honey came up repeatedly in the book of the Red Seal, so when I traced the name in the tabloids I knew I was onto something. When the article from 1952 surfaced, Bishop Honey disappears under mysterious circumstances. In Oyster Ridge, the story had become something of a sensation in the 50s. A Catholic bishop, the religious authority for an entire community, vanishes. No body is found. Do the people of Bishop's Head even care about the prominent death of the head of their clergy? Much paranoid speculation and conspiracy theories surrounded the internet in the press. For a moment, I stopped to question my motivations for researching. I'd gotten a long way off track from the tarot and related projects I was being paid to investigate. All that inhibition was suspended when I stumbled on information linking a feud between the Goebbels family and the Honey line. Goebbels, you may record, was the deceased bishop's house I was staying in. It seemed like Raymond Goebbels' ancestors had a long-running feud with the Honey family for chiefly titles in the valley, beginning with an even earlier disappearance of a Honey priest in 1801. The Honeys, it seemed, who heralded from Oyster Ridge, claimed succession to the Catholic priesthood, but the Goebbels family had successfully interrupted conventional Catholic channels to place themselves at the head of the church in Bishop's Valley. Then in the 50s, with the disappearance of Haziah Honey, the Goebbels had kept power ever since the name of the town was changed. Had the Goebbels resorted to murder to maintain their presence in the Catholic hierarchy of Bishop's Valley? It seemed like an absurd notion. I learned a great deal in the library today, not all of which I will elaborate on now, but there was one more book which stirred me emotionally and finally answered my question on what happened to the indigenous people of the valley. It was a thick book with little information on the spine, written evidently by academics from Oyster Ridge and out of place in the library shelves, as though it had been missing by a cataloguing committee who would have otherwise cleared out or removed the book with other unwanted or censored documentation. The book laid out the disturbing extermination of the Warrawol people as it happened over the 2 centuries of European occupation. I was astounded by the accounts of violence documented in this book, which had apparently been entirely omitted from other accounts of Valley history. It seemed there were two major events of violence in Bishop's Valley, one which could probably be called genocide. Such as one was the slaughter of the Warrigal on the hills of Moravale in the 40s and 50s. The other was the incident at Barry's Gateway, a plateau in Upper Body, where over 2,000 convicts were shot dead on the spot by a firing squad. The Oyster Ridge historian traced the indigenous murder back to 1811, where, following the killing of 16 cattle by Aboriginal people and subsequent murder of 9 Aboriginals, Governor Fishington declared martial law to restore order. In the ensuing decades, the rate of indigenous murder escalated, though the butchery apparently had nothing to do with theories about terra nullius or of Aboriginals being subhuman. A notable change in population was sometimes attributed to the increased violence, with many new faces migrating to Bishop's Head, perhaps bringing their prejudices with them. In 1821, gangs of stockmen from Bishop's Head and Moravale went on what was known as the Big Bushwhack, or simply the Drive, which was a hunt for Aboriginal people which lasted several months. They seemed to think there was nothing wrong with shooting Aboriginal people or raping Aboriginal women, and this is precisely what they did. So they noted the Oyster Ridge journalist with disgust and contempt. According to the documents, the stockmen herded the defenseless Aboriginal people together and tied their hands with a long rope. They then butchered them with bayonets, cutting them slowly and mercilessly. Late that night, other Aboriginal men who had been working at the neighbouring station returned to Bishop's Valley. They were urged to move on and headed off into the night. Shortly, the murderers returned and burned the bodies of their victims, then set out to find the Aboriginal people they had let go. They found the men the next day and murdered all of them. In 1946, 1948 and 1954, similar attacks occurred, with over 300 warriors slaughtered in each attack. In the 1954 attack, 22 beautiful young girls were allowed to live, only so that they could be raped. A woman was allowed to run with blood spurting out of her cut throat. She was then thrown alive onto the fire. Her infant child was thrown alive onto the fire as well. 4 young girls, mere children, were mutilated drastically. The killers allegedly immersed into heavy drinking after the killings. It was well documented that the murders were known in town, and were heard on the night of their foul deeds, celebrating riotously. Still, nothing was done. No charges were brought about. By 1957, the murder parties had become organized, almost along military lines, and by 1958 there were no warriors in Bishop's Valley. No explanation of the genocide was given, and somehow the event stayed beneath the radar of the national media. What's more, the bodies of the Aboriginal murdered were never retrieved. They have no marked graves or memorials anywhere. The bodies, for all intents and purposes, simply disappeared. A strange allegation that the bodies had been used to fertilize the mangroves sticks with me. Time had passed quickly in the library. It was already dusk when I checked my watch. I should have been able to tell by the darkness infiltrating the high-bolted windows. With my brain all full of clusterfuck from the confusing things I'd learnt, I began to gather up books I wanted to borrow or keep, including the books with the bishop's sign and the so-called Red Seal. I gathered the large tomes under my arm, mounted the ladder and descended to level 1, meandering slowly toward the counter. I was marginally surprised to find that the librarian was strangely absent. I couldn't see her out in the room, in the back beyond the glass partition, nor did she seem to be walking around the library floor. "Chelsea?" I called out timidly, suffocated by the vast echoing chamber. "Miss Chelsea." But there was neither a response nor a sound or resonance in the deadly quiet. I waited for 10 minutes, becoming anxious once more. I found research an intoxicating escape. When I was absorbed in research, nothing was on my mind. But now, as I stood in the piercing quiet, all my trauma began to resurface. The nausea and paranoia of my precarious situation became tireless. Moreover, it had just struck me that I had left the draft copies of my tarot set at Phoebe's house. I would have to go around there to pick them up. The wait became too much. Chelsea didn't appear to be there. Perhaps, I thought, she had left for the day, thinking I would just take whatever I wanted with me. In any case, I thought I would likely return to the library within the week, at which point I could surely return the books or check with her that it was okay that I hang on to them. Since standing up, my blackened thumb had exacerbated its aching and throbbing. I was at a low point and resolved to leave. Just as I was about to exit the building, a clattering noise along the roof stopped me dead in my track. What was it? Trying to discern where the noise had come from, I gazed around the ceiling, when suddenly there was another terrible noise, as though a piece of corrugated iron was being dragged along the side of the building. Carefully I walked through the automatic door into the starry darkness of evening. I moved cautiously, afraid of the source of the dreadful noise. I noticed immediately that there was another vehicle in the library parking lot, a grey Nissan Pulsar, licensed TYZ 999. Chelsea's car was gone, but I could make out a vague clamoring around the side of the library. Slowly and cautiously, I made my way to my own car, sliding into the driver's seat and starting the engine. There was a terrible smell of sewage coming from somewhere, so I powered up the aircon in a vain attempt to drown out the smell. I left the library rapidly, staring bulging-eyed into my rear-view mirror, fearing but almost not desiring to see whoever was making the deafening noise on the far side of the building. Nothing came into view except shapes in the shadows. In a short while I was back on the ragged trail leading to Pine Street. I had not gone far down the ragged path when I noticed the falling tree blocking my path ahead. It looked to have been uprooted, which was highly strange as I hadn't heard any strong winds whilst in the library. Ruefully, I had to exit the vehicle to inspect the situation. I was horrified when I exited the vehicle to note the foul sewage or compost smell had not died down. Moreover, there was a caged breeze. The whistling nature of it in and out reminded me of that breathing noise I had heard coming from the estuaries of the Mangroves. My thumb was positively throbbing with pain now. The pulsating horror of claustrophobic blood squelched with the full circulation of my pounding heartbeat. I needed a stiff drink just to anesthetize the pain, maybe some Xanax. Approaching the falling tree I could see was far too heavy to lift on my own. However, where the fence had been broken on the left, there appeared to be just enough space for my car to dodge it. I clumped over the crunking branches to inspect, where to my surprise I encountered some new, terrible aspect to the mystery. Along the grass there were 3 large, roughly triangular holes, each the size of a soccer ball. The dirt mounds beside them suggested that an animal had dug the holes. I would propose a wombat, were it not for the smaller piercings in the ground like stab holes from a conical or horn-shaped knife. Not contemplating for too long what animal may have been responsible for digging the holes or knocking over the trees, for my sanity's sake alone, I returned to my car, safely navigating the route along the grass to the side of the broken fence. It wasn't long before I had reached Phoebe's house. I don't know what it was that possessed me to concede to Phoebe. My prejudices against heroin had always been strong. She'd always been civil to me, however, and I couldn't be cold towards her when she invited me in, confiding me that the others were out in Upper Bodie for the night. Maybe it was her melancholy loneliness that I understood, or the creepy weather, the eerie sounds, and my aching thumb which persuaded me to accept a drink, then stay for several others. Maybe it was loneliness, or maybe it was something more. Unavoidable attraction of flames and moths, and as I was gathering up the tarot, Phoebe had innocently asked me if I was able to reading with the dummy cards. Of course, I told her it was possible. Obviously, I was keen to try out the new deck in any capacity I could. The wine was flowing steadily again, dangerously. She'd asked me first if I could go do my own tarot reading while she watched, for she knew what she was getting herself in for. I told her that it was considered a dangerous omen to read your own fortune, and that cultured practitioners avoided it. She'd then nervously taken the role of client. Shuffle the deck and think over some predicament, I told her authoritatively. There was a heavy tension between us, not least since the subject of heroin had not yet been broached. We avoided eye contact, as she contemplatively allowed the cards to slide around in her slender hands, delicate fingers, half closing her eyes. I had an uneasiness doing the reading which wasn't typical of my temperament. I'd never interfered with her layout before, but as soon as she placed down the first card and read with terror, "The Pointer of the Bond," something inside me had triggered, and I slammed my hand over hers. "Wait," I said hesitantly. "I'm supposed to shuffle first." As I quickly lifted and flicked the cards in Castino style, my brain was racing delicately. Why had I just felt the need to lie? That wasn't like me. Because of my research today? Because I didn't want to deal Phoebe a bad omen? The second time Phoebe dealt, I didn't interfere, even though once more something about the arrangement of cards had me siphoning dread. The first card I laid out was the Milky Way card. Then crisscrossed on top of it, Judgment. Why the repetition of these two cards again? What could it mean? Phoebe stared at me now, sensing the anxiety in my eyes. "What does it mean?" she stammered, echoing my thoughts. "Is it bad?" No, not at all," I replied, recovering, trying to create a more superficial answer than the one I sensed in my terror-filled heart. "It's a metaphysical question you are asking." I didn't say the words that were truly on my tongue, the words I feared. "It tells me your question is a broad one, about life. You are seeking an answer to something profoundly deep, or perhaps you are trying to grapple with the random processes of the universe." She looked at me, cynical but yearning, as if she knew I was right, but pondered the vagueness of the answer. Couldn't any question be considered in that vein? No, not all questions. I laid out 4 more cards, then flipped them over one by one. Star-crossed lovers, the unlucky bushman, the rainbow serpent, the corroboree. I didn't like the thoughts coming into my mind, but it felt impossible not to play them out now. "Well?" she asked impatiently. I rubbed my face with apprehensive tenseness. "The lover in the past tense, to some degree. I feel your question is about yourself, about fate." "Don't titter around," she snapped. "Obviously it's a question about love. I don't need your interpretation to see that the cards are at least on the ball." "Right," I said, wishing I could somehow move backwards in time instead of forwards to the inevitable pitfall ahead. "The unlucky bushman rising is in direct relationship with your fears," I said, avoiding what I read there. "But what does it mean?" she hissed. I sighed heavily. It could mean that there is a male figure who has recently entered your life. A man who is what? Doomed, perhaps. Doomed to some unpredictable fate." Phoebe went silent. I read on, afraid to dwell for too long. "The rainbow serpent and the corroboree in the future tense," I said thoughtfully, as this part at least hadn't clarified completely in my mind. "There is a meeting place, an event in the future, a perilous meeting." Phoebe leapt in here, trying to interpret the cards herself. "A meeting on Serpentine Road," she said. "The man of my affection is fated to a fateful meeting on Serpentine Road." "No," I stopped her, my heart pounding, not liking the insinuation. I don't think the cards would suggest anything so literal." "So what then?" I stammered. "Let me look at the final cards to put it in perspective." I flipped the final 4 cards in a vertical row. The Gateway, 9 rifles, Fall of the Outlaw, Ye Old Hangman. Some incalculable misery ran through my blood as I digested the cards before me. First, the uncanny and unwholesome fear came that in spite of my best efforts and protestation, that I was in some sense reading my own fortune. And even more, that there wasn't just the slightest of a hint of the tragic about it. Phoebe just looked up at me silently now. Her eyes demanded an explanation of the cards dealt. "To the immediate future and the conclusion of your fortune," I said, gulping in the back of my throat, "there is something in..." "What?" she said. "Something bad, isn't it?" I don't know. Cards can be ambiguous, but the meeting referred to seems to be fated to some foreseeable ill. What do you say? She persisted. The gateway. The gateway implies the opening up of some new... Barry's Gateway! That's a place, Phoebe yelled. It's a plateau up in Upper Bodie. Something about Barry's Gateway. No, I think you're being too literal. 9 rifles is a force of negativity. Something surmounting against you, or the male figure. There is a definite descent, an end to the narrative. A tragic decline to the romance. Something... What's the hangman mean? She asked. What's the fall of the outlaw? I went quiet again, feeling green. I backed away from the cards. Phoebe had sensed it in me. I hadn't resisted at all, happy to take on any escape. She drove towards me and our lips met. The wine was heavy on both our lips, but the heat was irresistible. I felt my eyes close before I knew she had pulled off her loose-fitting top, and my hands were running over her soft flesh. What impulse had so overpowered me? I wasn't a creature of such simple persuasion. In the frolicking of our passionate embrace, moving to Phoebe's bedroom, anything had seemed plausible, and with a sense of foreboding on the horizon, I so desperately wanted to escape into the present. My pants had been around my ankles as she had thus straddled me. For a long time we warmly melded, thrusting towards nothing but a chemical bliss. When she'd sidled off for a moment, I had appreciated the tease, continuing to stroke my hard cock. I hadn't even registered negative emotion as I watched her tie the strap around her arm and push the syringe over the bubbling spoon. The intoxication was all over me. I'd only asked, "Why do you need it?" To which she had seductively whispered, Try it. And somehow all willpower and resistance within me had absconded. I tied the black leather strap on myself, pulling until it was taut and my arm throbbed with lack of blood flow. The pain in my blackened thumb increased, and I welcomed the sharp, piercing dullness of the needle, which heralded a Christ-like relief from burden. The instant the chemicals hit my bloodstream, I felt a warm thrill of incalculable ecstasy, which I had avoided my entire life. The screaming apathy of utter release from the pain of life. I don't recall at what stage in our love-making the hallucinations begun. It all sits fresh in my memory like a dream I've just awoken from. I remember kissing her neck, the mark, when I'd noticed something unusual about that birthmark below her collarbone. It pulsed. I'd calmly watched it grow, like the laceration glowing, like pink neon as the lips of the wound pursed and opened up like a budding rose petal, emitting light. I vaguely remember looking inside that gaping pink hole, and inside the periscope of pink ribbon, viewing objectively 1,000 sexual fantasies, bodies writhing within over each other in a glorious bright pink Mardi Gras of lust and life, cocks sliding in and out of cunts like pistons, platforms of tits. I must have lost time. It could have been hours later for all I know, as I recall coming to a relative degree of consciousness slumped against the grimy bedroom wall. The walls were textured like leaves, wet leaves. Phoebe was not in sight, but I was hallucinating twice as much now. I remember feeling like my body was submerged in water, that the room was filled with ecstasy, like a bathtub, but through some unseen sinkhole. Joy was slowly draining. Something had alerted me to the sensation in my penis, and I had looked down, initially seeing Phoebe's dainty hand rubbing furiously up and down, but then I had looked again, surprised by the change, and what I saw when I first looked down first succeeded the paranoid half of the trip. Instead of a dick, all I could see when I looked beneath was a wet, muddy mangrove stalk, pulsating wildly and dribbling at the end. The floor was all mud now. That was all I could see from wall to wall. My mangrove stalk throbbed and gibbered. The mud bubbled and spluttered. I sat there like a tree submerged in the water for I don't know how long. I knew that all my joy had fled. But still there was something darker that permeated everything. I remember my black hand behind like tree roots that wound down to the earth. Thumb was like the night sky. The pain was mere being. There was a laptop on the dressing table. I stared at it for half an hour at least. The light of the screen like a halo, wavy digital lines warped by my viewpoint. There was a meaning I couldn't grasp. The plant thing stumbled back into the room now. Wet branches for legs. It rustled with leaves, slinking like a dragging branch. The plant lady straddled me, rubbing itself over my trunk. I don't remember how I got home. I know that I lay in bed for hours before the trip finally subsided. I know that the peak terror came traversing the dark path from Phoebe's house to mine. I still can't think over it clearly as I lay here now in bed. Was any of it real? I can still hear the cicadas as I lay here. I know. There's something down there in the dark. There's something horrible. Down in the mangroves!
The Mangroves of Bishop's Valley, Chapter 4, The Gateway 9 Rifles. I'm thinking more and more about documents hidden in the dark of the basement, down the stairs, behind the green door in the courtyard, at the back of Archbishop Raymond Gubble's house. I am convinced there's some piece of information there which holds the explanation of these awful goings-on. Tomorrow I will break the lock, search for the answer. Today I must lie here in my own bed, reflect, record, then sleep. It's been 2 weeks since my last recorded journal. It's a Thursday. A great deal has happened in the last fortnight. I can only guess where to begin filling in my readers. Phoebe and I have continued casual encounters. I may indeed be mildly addicted to heroin. I have spent a great deal of time with Nora and David. We are becoming good friends, though the whole group's foundations appear to be built upon quicksand. In some ways we were all tiptoeing around glass, aware of some inevitable looming catastrophe in our self-funded addictions. I believe David and Phoebe may have had previous sexual relations. There is a tension there, although I sense that their passion was extinguished some time ago. We've had some intense and deep conversations as a group about the meaning of life, the nature of reality, love, existentialism, and death. I see something in David that I failed to recognize in myself previously. Now I can't help but sense it constantly. He is looking for something, the same thing I've always been seeking myself. Some grand join the dots, a map of information to collate the puzzle pieces of history, philosophy, science, psychology, art, knowledge, the world, and the self. Somehow unite it all under a colossal shadow, to recognize a faceless demon of truth who haunts the living with its indescribable yet terrible form. Something. More abrasive run-ins with the locals. There is a constant threatening air amidst their kin, only mildly masked by passive-aggressive mockery. David and Phoebe have given me deeper information about the local fraternities, but that puzzle may have to wait till later. Phoebe told me the truth about how she got her birthmark. I don't know if I'm ready to share that information yet either. My agent called me last Wednesday. That was an odd conversation. I only met Jason Briers once, but he seemed like a nice gentleman. Jason was the artist who was supposed to be working on the tarot project. It would have been, if successful, referred to as the Flynn VanDeBerg deck, I suppose. I can't pretend I wasn't shocked when Vicky told me that Briers had shot himself in his home and wouldn't be working on the project anymore. I don't know the man well enough to be devastated, but it certainly had an effect on me. Jason and I had
brief conversations online via Snapchat. I'll probably miss his funeral, which is a shame. It's a tragic waste of a rare talent. I hope there is nothing correct in my suspicious nature which wants to see something more in his tragic event than a horrid but accidental waste of life. It seemed to pass very quickly and conveniently that Davo would subsume the role of artist. Actually, it had partially been my idea. The agent thoroughly embraced it. David has also jumped at the opportunity. He was already painting large images of the tarot cards on the walls of the old hospital last I left him on Monday. His picture of the unlucky bushman card is quite haunting, I say, taking all the qualities of the Rider-Waite Fool card and adding some unique Australian menace. He perfectly captured the crackled bushland in that arid cruelty, something akin to Sidney Nolan's Outback and Drought series. Weeks in the library have gotten me no closer to revelation. Chelsea has curiously not been working. Her replacement is a sullen old man who never says a word and watches me with his squinty eyes through cloudy spectacles. I dare say I have grown extremely paranoid. I never leave the house without taking Goebbels' shotgun from the wall above the fireplace. I've taken to hiding ammunition in random places. My bag, the car. I took the gun out just last Tuesday, determined to see more of the sacred indigenous sites. I have already seen the crown of the Shadow King and a great many other remarkable artworks in the surrounding caves. The usual congregation of hard-boiled men collect themselves uptown. They stare at my car, going to and from the sacred places, of course. I've taken to clutching the old double barrel even as I wander around the sun-damaged bushland near the cave sites. Sometimes I sense men tracking me. I have seen men with suits and fedoras congregating at odd locations during my walks. Often I've cocked my gun, pointed it nervously as the sound of twigs breaking under hard paths to and from the cave sites are almost always second-rate, overgrown, and clearly neglected by men for some time. I have often had to bushwhack through hard scrub, sometimes hacking my way through miles of dry wood in the surrounding fields of ash-grey, burnt-out banksia trees. The crackling fingers snap off at the touch, surreal towers of rounded red stone which mark the indigenous defensive spiritual barrier towers. There appears to be a parasite or virus affecting the gum trees on the northern end of town. Most are ridden with a thick purple moss, the insides often festering, mulched, leaves rotting in piles upon the dirt. I have also had to endure chastisement from stinging nettles and heavy-set briars which pierce through the flimsy material of my pants. The rewards have been supple. The sacred art suggests an intricate paranoia to the Warrawal, not usually allowed primitive societies for mere function. The painterly mathematical diagrams at different locations around the valley form a complex equation about the slow degradation of the Warral way of life. It's almost as if they saw the downfall of their culture before it happened. And though they knew the presence of white man marked their extinction, their calculations are much more aligned with the terror of whatever spiritual threat they perceive as occupying or emanating from the mangroves, which the Warral viewed as far more disturbing than their own extinction. More disturbing still to me was today, as I was wandering down the trail between the library and aviary paddock. I had been petrified by a gunshot. Diving onto the lumpy, gum-nut-covered dirt and clutching the shotgun, I couldn't see a damned thing through the walls of twisting bushland on either side of me. I know the gunshot had been fired nearby, above my head from the sound of it. I don't think the shot had been fired at me, but I do believe it had been intended to threaten me. It had been my object to explore Upper Bodie and Moravale sometime in the coming week, and the morning gunshot had been enough to fast-track the idea. I returned home to get the car, Phoebe was there, on my veranda, with Nora, getting high. I didn't tell them about the gunshot, staving off chit-chat and explaining my intention to travel to Moravale. No, I didn't want Phoebe to come, I told her. It would be too distracting to my very important work. An odd feeling returned to me as I drove uptown. Ever since the fateful tarot reading with Phoebe the night before we first made love, I have been afraid of Phoebe's curious over-intellectualization of the cards, her prediction of her lover's downfall, a fateful meeting at Serpentine Road, and some mystery at Barry's Gateway, all had me overanalyzing everything. Was I the lover who had been foretold of in Phoebe's cards? Had I predicted my own doom? Serpentine Road was the only way in and out of town, and knowing I had to traverse it to get to Moravale had already made me cautious to go. What if this grey foretold meeting came true? As usual, the townsmen were all gathered around the shops on Prime Street. Today they had seemed particularly testosterone-fueled. With their backs to the street, they were mobbing raucously around the doctor's surgery for some reason, obviously clamoring to look at something inside. I could hear Bruce laughing boisterously from within, keen to get out of this suffocating town for a few hours, yet highly curious as to what the men were doing. I cautiously slowed down my car to suss out the brouhaha. I had never paid attention to the surgery previously, and now found myself analyzing the strange building, with its archaic blue communist-style logo and deco trimmings. There was an old-style sign near the side alley which read, Cameron Bain and A. Tasman, who I suppose were the town surgeons, but then to my utter perplexity I observed their specialist titles beneath. Biosculptor, Skin Resurfacer. Now what on earth was a biosculptor, and why would a small town like this need anyone remotely aligned with that profession? Two of the men had noticed me now, and turned to face the car, walking towards me. I was tempted to drive off, but I didn't want to draw excess attention to myself. I recognized the men. They were men I had been acquainted with in the last couple of weeks. One was Clancy Dixon. He was a hired muscle man from out of town. I believe he worked for Banjo, the town figurehead. The other was Gaza, aka Mudslide. The other man apparently referred to Gary as Mudslide because he comes from Moravale and bear near ties to an aboriginal lineage through a rape. "Hello, Flynn," said Dixon threateningly. "Come to hang around some real men, have ya? Sick of your deadbeat junkie mates already. It's a dog's balls, ain't it, being a garden egg, ain't it? You better get out of this town, VanDeBerg, if you know what's good for you." Gaza reaffirmed like a $10 lackey. "Even Mudslide wants you gone, you old coon. What do you think of that?" "I'm already on my way," I said firmly. "Off to Moravale, sightseeing. Snooping around again, you cunt. You got some nose on you, mate. Be careful where you go sticking your nose into round here. We want no Snoop Dogg in these parts. You get it, matey-o? That's the sort of mutt ought to be sent straight to the pound, get me? Now piss off, you dog." A feeling of loathing burrowed into me as I slowly drove away. As Dixon came at me with a few more slurs of encouragement, his face red with hatred, yelling at the car boot. The winding bends of Serpentine Road were not as ominous as I feared. At least they were clear of human life, dumb cows and fields. Anything seemed soothing after you were out of the presence of those horrifying rednecks uptown. It wasn't a long drive into Moravale, and it occurred to me I really had no plan of where to visit. There weren't many sacred sites in Moravale, and I wondered if my reason to explore wasn't entirely based on getting out of Bishop's Valley for a day. As I drove into town, those familiar dull factories and industrial warehouses came into view. It wasn't as ugly as the first time I viewed it. With the big purple mountain behind it, it was difficult for the scene to be made out completely ugly, even with all these wasteland of industrial ambition. The town seemed busier than the last time I had driven through it. The hustle and bustle of rustled country cars surrounded, The men who peered from car windows looked no less sinister than the brawny men who hung around Bishop's Valley shops all day. In my rearview mirror, I noticed another uneasy jolt. I recognized the car behind me. It was the grey Nissan Pulsar that had been parked at the library 2 weeks ago. It was definitely the same car. I remember the license plate. TYZ999. What was the car doing out here in Morrowvale? Was somebody following me? I couldn't get a clear image of the driver. He had scrappy brown hair, maybe a hairpiece, and he was wearing dark sunglasses. He was trailing me at a distance, moving out of sight whenever I slowed or parked. I wanted to get out of sight for a while, see if the man in the Pulsar would give up. So I stopped at a public observation area. There was a steep incline through a bush path which led up to the observation green. Some kind of viewing spot, I suppose. I figured if I blew some time here, the guy in the car might lose interest in my tourist activities. Quickly I staggered along the trail, a pile of twisted broken wood, a dead tree, a pagan essence following me up. I stopped on the flat, overgrown grass, out of breath. I hadn't expected anything eventful to occur up on the hill. However, the viewpoint gave an excellent vantage spot to see Morrowvale. A sprawl of tin roofs, brick houses, and smoking factory chimneys lay over the horizon like an oversized industrial cemetery. But my eye was drawn particularly to one area of interest in the bushland beside a nearby factory. There was a procession of men engaged in apparently sinister activity. About 20 men in suits, laboring in a way their attire didn't necessitate. They were moving some type of goods, dragging heavy sacks from one place to another, lowering the giant brown mesh bags into a commercial truck, whilst others looked on and directed. There was a large hall nearby the location. I could tell by its architecture it was a niche hall, not a corporate place. Some of the men were leaving the lodge, whilst others loaded the trucks. For some reason, I resolved to investigate, sliding carefully down the grassy hill, being careful to stay behind the bushes, out of sight. I think I could just make out what the men had been loading into the bags, because there was a mound of something not quite right to the far side of the grass clearing. From the looks of things, the men were cleaning up from an event which had occurred recently. Clambering over the shrubbery, I continued my descent to comprehend the strange scene. I had to tread carefully. Since I had been taking the junk, I'd noticed some odd side effects. I'd never hallucinated sober, but I had started getting a hazy purple discoloration to my vision of late. Occasionally my eyes blurred, and I couldn't see well. I still couldn't tell what the light brown mound was. The men carrying bags had all but left now, and one of the big trucks had started up its engine. Something convinced me it was safe to enter the open field. Bile rose in my throat as I realized what the pile of fresh bodies was, of the same matter as those dangling slabs of meat nailed to the trees. Massacred kangaroos and other bodies. I'd hopefully assumed some sort of butchery for consumption, but the way the men were dressed, and the way they loaded the carcasses in brown bags into trunks, something was not at all right in this arrangement. I scaled the walls quickly, in case the men returned to retrieve more corpses. I wondered where the trucks were taking the corpses. I could hear male voices now, but one of the trucks was definitely departing along the road out front, slowly moving along the other side of the building. I tried to examine what the strange hall was. The building had an almost religious quality, like a modern Protestant church in its functionality, but with more ancient trimmings, almost an air of Scientology about it. Ominous closure of a kind was brought when I noticed the strange symbol of a chess bishop upon the balustrade, the same one imprinted on the old library book I had borrowed. Moving stealthily like a jaded private investigator, I made my way further around the side of the lodge, hoping to find some more useful clues as to the building's purpose. There was a partition of the building which extended out upon which was an open window. Maintaining a low altitude, I strafed along the wall until I could get a narrow view inside. Slowly raising my head, I found myself looking into a room, empty of people, lights off, in the darkness. I could only vaguely deduce the shapes of a filing cabinet, a safe, and metal shelves. The voices out the front of the building made me hesitant to break in and enter. But with a little optimism, I noticed a bound leather folio on the table just below the window. With the small bits of flexibility and cunning, I was sure I could reach it through the opening. Red in the face, flexing from muscles, on tiptoes, my arm stretched as far as it could. The hard wooden frame dug into my underarm, but successfully I grasped the book and retrieved it. I fled hurriedly now back into the thick foliage, paranoid I might be seen. Not stopping to read the book, I concealed it beneath my coat. Then, with wilderness cunning, I hurriedly ascended the hill I had come down, maintaining in the shadows of the shrubbery, scarpering to return to the viewing plateau, top of the hill. Scanning the horizon and convinced I had gotten away with my theft, I returned to the path that led back down to my car. At the bottom, I couldn't see the man in the grey Nissan Pulsar, and eager to keep it that way, I placed the book on the passenger seat of my car and engaged the throttle. Within a minute, I was back on the road, uncertain of my destination, heart beating in my chest from the thrill of my crime, but moreover from the brash red iconography that stared up at me. There it was again, shining blasphemously, the all too familiar red seal on the cover of the book. I knew I had to pull over and browse the book somewhere, but no sheltered parking spot seemed to reach out. I drove in through the industrial end of Mangroves until I reached a quiet street with an odd assortment of rundown shops. There was an out-of-the-way parking spot behind a tall, twisting blue gum. Turning the ignition key off, I immediately grabbed the leather journal and flipped through it. It was another corporate round of some kind. Corporate record. For the most part, it was nothing more than a list of names and numbers. My lungs collapsed in a disappointed exhalation of warm air. Flipping from page to page, I was daunted by the mundane, cryptically vacant notes. And then I stopped and shuddered. I recognized some of these names. There! J. Briers. What was Jason, the artist who killed himself, doing listed in this curious account-keeping book? I searched the listing under his name. Termination of employment. Then another. P. Rimboard. That was Phoebe's name. There was a tick next to her name under the title Bishop's Head. N. James. D. Ernesto. That could be Phoebe and David. C. Hirsch. I'll bet $1 million that's Chelsea, the librarian. She said herself she was employed by an agency named Red Seal Recruit, though I only just now made the correlation. I wondered how the Red Seal Corporation were linked to Black Lab, my publisher. My name was in the book too, F. VanDeBerg, scheduled for relocation. This had given me much to think about. Hiding the book in my glove box, I exited the vehicle, choosing to browse the quaint old antique store opposite, to give my brain space to think and to keep looking natural, just in case I was still being observed. The shop was called Alderman's Little Junk Shop. In the window were various vintage anomalies, a giant polyester statue of Blinky Bill, the classic Australian cartoon koala, a cardboard cutout of Ned Kelly, legendary Australian bushranger, an array of vintage police rifles, undoubtedly my eyes scanned counting them. 4, 8, 9. There were 9 rifles. My thoughts were racing as I entered the store, primarily in regards to what Phoebe had told me about how she had gotten the mark on her neck. All the input of my senses suggested that there was something sinister happening, orchestrated by this Red Seal company. But what? Rows of colonial pottery, jolly men's faces with pink noses, governor hats, and whiskey bottles in hand. Then there were Asian Pacificer Islander masks, tiki and tribal sculptures, some authentic indigenous spears. None of this did anything to sedate my fears or provide me answers. I started to feel altogether queasy, claustrophobic in Morrovale. My resolve was quickly to drive up the ridge and scope out Opal Bodhi before sunset. The owner of the antique store scowled menacingly as I left through the strings of hanging beads, a ringing bell marking my exit. But before long I was back out on the road, leaving the putrid pollution and slums of Morrovale and winding back into the stark country road northwestwards, into the humble mining town. The view towards Upper Bodhi was altogether beautiful, rich bushland skirting the lower half of the other ranges of the valley. Blues and purples and reds collecting in a moving impressionist painting as the sun slowly rested its head against the mountain, ready for sleep. I'm ashamed to admit, but certain urges had begun to take afternoon liberties with me. Right now I was stinging for a fix as I scanned the tattered map on the passenger seat beside me, looking for a more uninhabited region of Upper Body to take a quick pit stop. One particular landmark stood out to me, impressed upon my brain: Barry's Gateway. It was only 5 minutes down the road from where I was, and before I knew it, I'd arrived at the remarkable bushland reserve. Lush native banksia trees furtively lined the outskirts of the park. Further up on the hillside, the quaint rooftops of residential properties were observable. But there was no sign of life in Barry's Gateway, except for the old barn on the far side of the park. I looked nervously around to make sure I was alone. Then, untying the ribbon on the black velvet purse, I removed the syringe and a small satty. It's amazing how quickly a habit becomes second nature. Before long, I had a lighter burning under a used stainless steel spoon. The tension of the strap was jubilation. I felt my heart accelerate as the point of the needle pierced my vein. Then my memory fogged somewhat. There was the part where I stumbled out of the car to look at the sunset. Organism running through my blood and heat in my pink cheeks. I'm quite sure I stood on the grass at the gateway for a long time. The hallucinations had come to me again in droves. They were positive at first. It was almost like a 70s musical. In the pastel colors of the sunset I'd envisioned thousands of naked dancing bodies, life celebrating itself, dancing in an orange heaven. Happy memories waltzed around in the reflecting light, whilst I'm quite sure Let the Sun Shine In had begun to play on invisible loudspeakers inside my ears. But as the colored disk of daylight had actively fell behind the mountain, as heat dissipated and night stretched out its arms, panic and sorrow returned to me. I felt that sensation again, of joy slowly draining away with the night sky. I began to think too much. The story of the massacre at Barry's Gateway began to occupy my thoughts. The slaughter of the indigenous population here was horrible enough, but there was something about the murder of 2,000 convicts by the gentry of Bishop's Valley that disturbed me even more. Racism could at least be negated to bigotry, ignorance, scapegoating. But who were these men who so loathed humanity? Race, class, gender meant nothing to them. These men scared me more than all the others. Men who were colorblind yet homicidal, psychopathic, having no empathy, yet desiring power or dominion over other men. I think I fell asleep on the grass, merging with paranoid dreams of flowing interconnected serpents of nature, Art Nouveau tentacles stretching through everything, life and nature, a patchwork quilt of an unknown yet sinister design. I believe that I reached some sort of spiritual endarkenment out there on the grass at Bishop's Gateway, Upper Bodhi. Gazing up at the stars, my consciousness became one with the valley. I became Bishop's Head. At the time, I felt the ego conflict with tomorrow, as though the place itself wanted to erase my new memories so it could awake to some purer daylight tomorrow morning. In the car, a procession of hallucinations followed me home, flying along beside the car. It was as though invisible alien life forms had always been occupying dimensional spaces parallel to our own. But only now had I been able to grasp their function in the ecosystem of time, weaving destiny, inhabiting separate dimensions like reality amphibians, the strange orb pixies with skin textured like testicles may have been the ones digging those holes, I thought, insanely. Their spindly appendages seemed well acquainted to cutting and digging. Eventually I accepted that nothing was actually there outside the car. As I sobered up and arrived home, the hallucinations had abated, but my troubled mind had not. I've been laying in bed for hours now, unable to sleep or calm my racing thoughts. I need to know what happened to the honey line of bishops and to what extent the Gobble men were involved. There must be some explanation, some link between the Red Seal Company and the replacement of local figureheads. I can still hear the trucks driving in and out of town and parking down on the southern boat ramp. I know what they are doing. I know that they are dumping the meat down there on the mangroves, but I still can't understand why. The answers are in Gobble's basement. They must be. And tomorrow I will have the answers. The Mangroves of Bishop's Valley, Chapter 5, The Unlucky Bushman. I shattered the lock with an iron bar, ramming it repetitively like a madman. The brass lock fell off the green door, clattering on the cement step. The latch was loud as I opened the rusty door in defiance, pushing the stiff hinges and finally setting foot inside Raymond Gobble's basement. It was dark, but there was an old-fashioned hanging globe with a mangy pull string. Yanking the cord, the globe bounced and flickered on, twinkling in and out with a hateful electronic buzz as I began to look around. There was a horrible stench, like expired sardines. The old splintered table with the opals and candles revealed little to me about the owners, although the opals glistened beautifully, purchased from an opal shop in Ober Bodie, according to the receipt on the display container. There was limited interest around the rust-stained walls. Finally, I found a locked antique cabinet which seemed to hold promise. Using the butt of the shotgun, I pounded downwards with a Spartan force upon the chain, forcing the links to snap, opening the double doors with great ease. I knew I had struck the jackpot. The shelves were stacked with interesting items. Pulling things out with random precision, I at once removed a folded pile of what I at first thought were sheets, but when removed and laid out flat upon the ground, I realized were actually clerical outfits. They must have been the bishop and priest clothes of the Gobble's descendants. They were curiously designed, many twirling ornaments of purple and gold, strange insignia, but of little use to me. There was also a cardboard box which I pulled out, and a stack of heavy manila folders. Inside the box were items of worship and decoration, probably from the church. More candles, holy water, sacrament holders, and golden donation plates. Using my lighter, I ignited one of the candles to get a better light source. There were some scattered framed and loose photographs in the bottom of the box, which I removed one by one and examined. A black and white photo of Raymond Gobbles and his father, Raymond Sr. The men were very staunch and conservative-looking, rolls of fats hanging around their neck, and an excess of skin around their eyes. Gobble's father almost looked like the shifty old Pope, Ratzinger. There were more photos of other clergy and unknown stoic men. I placed the pile of photos on the floor to handle the manila folders, but as I did so, a photo slid out which captured my attention. 4 men wearing hoods and outfits in the style of the Ku Klux Klan. I studied the photo for some time, with no description. There was no way to tell if any of the men were Gobbles, as they were all masked. From the stock of the paper and grainy black and white, slightly brown print, I knew they were from the same era as the other photos, at least. I rifled through some of the documents in the manila folders. Birth certificates, birth, death, and marriage certificates, in fact. Not just for the Gobbles men, but for the whole damn town, by the looks of it. No idea why Gobbles would have hung on to those. One of the documents, at least, was revealing. Passports for the Gobbles from Germany between the dates of 1790 and 1950. Her Selman Goebbels, a member of the Nazi Party. Wow! Had the Goebbels somehow managed to evade the Nuremberg trials? Then came the piece de resistance, a green hardcover journal from 1882. I had expected the journal to belong to one of the Gobble line of bishops, but when I saw the name Honi, I knew I'd found the piece of the puzzle I was missing. Petra Honi, Diary, 1882. Some interesting passages. And on the collecting the testimonies of the townspeople, the strange sightings of floating lights in the night sky, and those sometimes invisible floaters who are said to resemble giant insects, suggesting two possible causations: mass hallucination caused by externals tampering with the water supply, or hysteria. Confession booths burdens can have devastating effects on the clergy. Reverend Diocese, of course, is a stunning example of why a 43-year-old man ought not to be privy to the sexual fascinations of 12-year-old girls. But then there are the other matters, the paranoid secrets of the laity. How often I've had to calmly assuage suggestions that the mayor is not the mayor. And what of those out-of-towners whose ungodly congregations in the old hall at Marrowvale, those rituals of theirs, the representatives growing numbers in official places, wearing the skin, so to speak in the old tongue. All a man of God can do is raise his arms in the air and say, "I simply don't know about all of that." And the journal continues. We had a mission to the psychiatric ward on Crow Street before it moved to Marrowvale. It breaks a God-fearing man's heart to see the torments of the insane. Their delusions are so concrete, yet if they could just take up the Bible, I am confident that their collective unconscious worlds might meet with the salvation of the Lord. They share a collective paranoia, screaming out that they are the ones gifted to see the ego death of the collective unconscious void. Amidst their word-salad talking in tongues, they see themselves as the victims of the truth, of knowing too much, and therefore being dismantled by the agents of reality. The Gobbles have made another grab for power. I'm quite sure they aim to completely replace the old lineage of the clergy. I'm watching them with care, for I know that certain institutions and the Blue Boys are all working together for the one end. Men of power all meet in the same bars, whatever face they present to the world. And the journal continues. One of the mental patients has me particularly disturbed. Her belief in malevolent entities is detailed. One finds caution faulting her logic, though her superstitions are questionable. She shares with the Aborigines and the common man of Bishop's Head the perplexing fear of the Mangroves that is so typical in the genius loci of the town. She talks of presences which lurk in certain places. She says something old has existed down there in that swamp since before the dinosaurs were around. Some lurking force of utter hatred that would turn all of creation on its head if it only had the chance. Then there are the other forces to her paranoia, which she believes operate outside whatever that dark presence is, maybe even working against it. One seeks to shatter ego and unite consciousness to recuperate the shards of its own mind, she says. The other, a conspiracy of men to keep this superficial facade of reality up. Keep us all imprisoned in a society of growing industrialization and consumerism. Slavery. She says they tear off the flesh. They tear off the masks every day. Tear it all off until they are only of the muscle of the organism that goes back to the beginning of life on Earth. They feed the flesh to the mangroves. Then every morning they dress dreams up with reality, gore with skin. They sew up the meat, graft the skin back on. They are wearing us, she says. Oh, the pity of the mad. I still find stranger entries in the journal as it continues. But then, didn't they cut off my ancestor's head and impale it upon a pike? Didn't they already serve her the honey name in some perverse ritual? Isn't that what they named the town thereafter? Bishop's Head? And another final entry. The men who really run the world, I've seen their rituals, masks and ceremonies which herald back to the ancient times. Bishops wearing the robes of the clan. It's only the most absurd blasphemy. Do they come? This last entry stirred my attention, and I rapidly found myself searching the photos again for the pictures with the masks. To my surprise and terror, I found that the photo I had seen was not the only one with the clansmen and other sinister costumed figures mixing with prominent Catholic clergy. There were animal head masks, gold theater masks, elaborate octopoid hats. I managed to couple the content of the revealing photos with certain documents from the folders. There were various photos of local lawmen and politicians engaging with apparent clansmen. Actually, the headswear was not entirely clan-like, seeming to differ in certain ranking. In some cases, the tall bishop's hats were interchangeable with the half-clan-like headwear. These photos showed notable officiants engaging in private mystical engagements. One had a photo of King George V himself engaging with a clan like Knight of Malta. This photo went particularly well with an article from the 1930s. I had already learned something of the relationship between certain local groups and the New Guard fascists of the 1930s. The New Guard, of course, were an infamous right-wing paramilitary group who had made storm waves, promoting fascism and engaging in vigilante justice in New South Wales. The same time Hitler was rising to power. I of course remember the controversy that occurred before the New Guard disappeared in the early 30s, apparently migrating en masse to the valley. The Premier of New South Wales was Jack Lang at the time of the controversy. Lang was a larger-than-life Australian socialist politician with a Leninist charisma who championed the labour movement of socialist reform, introduced universal suffrage and brought hope in the worst depression in history. His black suit and top hat was fitting of such a wild and passionate orator. On the 19th of March 1932, Lang was all set to open the iconic Sydney Harbour Bridge, which through monumental labour and a subsequent death toll was finally complete. Lang was to deliver a sensational speech comparing the bridge to the struggle for the Australian dream, the achievement which would so greatly inspire the people. But he didn't know that a secret plot to undermine him was occurring behind the scenes. Lang had already created some controversy when he insisted that he would open the bridge himself rather than allowing the governor, the King's New South Wales representative, to open it with the usual regal ceremony. George VI was furious when he was told of Lang's decision. The Crown already staunchly against Lang's socialist agenda. As it happened, George got his own secret wish, for just as Premier Lang was about to cut a ribbon to open the Sydney Harbour Bridge, Captain Francis de Groot, a member of the fascist New Guard, who had already planned on kidnapping Lang and plotting a statewide coup, rode up wearing his old regimental uniform and slashed the ribbon with his cavalry sword in a statement of protest and tribute in service to the King. In the article, it went on to explain that after Lang was deposed, Lang, who had aimed to abolish Australia's debts to the United Kingdom and cut the heads of the banking elite, a man with many enemies, the New Guard practically disappeared. Except during one rather notorious court case, where on charges of a vigilant-style assault, allegations arose of a secret inner circle of the New Guard, who conducted secret rituals, donning ceremonial Ku Klux robes. The case caused a political storm, but was washed away in preceding scandals, so that the extent of this inner circle was never exposed to the world. It is known that the New Guard movement sprung out of the Old Guard, a powerful group who were all members of Sydney's elite, including the director of the Bank of New South Wales, the head of defence, the mayor of North Sydney, Alderman Primrose, who was also a member of the New Guard, and an official of the bridge opening ceremony. The possibility that he and others may have aided de Groot before his staged arrest remains a prominent myth among conspiracy theorists. But these photos seem to prove the existence of a true underground current of power, secret ties between Hitler, the King of England, and the Australian clergy, as absurd as it sounds. A conspiracy of vast proportions. Then if these men had set up some kind of miniature society down here in the valley, maybe, just maybe. My thinking in the basement was interrupted by a loud bang and clattering. Quickly, I had emerged from the den to the exposed air. I couldn't locate the source of the noise. However, there was now, at noon, a laughing tone to the wind, and a rather stifling and menacing quality to the heat in the background. To the whispering, Mangroves chatted aimlessly with the wind blowing through the estuary. With my shotgun at arm, I cautiously walked around the perimeter of the house. Anxious at the origin of the noise, I did not hesitate when I caught the vague outline of somebody standing on my veranda. Rolling commando style to a stealth position on the lawn, I cocked the gun and drew to my feet, holding the shotgun menacingly. "I see you, fucker!" But the figure was not alarmed. I could see now that it was Phoebe. She had her head in her hands and she was sobbing. Quickly I dropped the weapon to my side and ran sympathetic towards her, taking her in my arms. Her body was stiff and she gave me no warmth. "What is it?" I asked. Shivering and sobbing, Phoebe said nothing and made no sound for some time. Finally, gathering the most minute strength, she looked up at me through tear-stained eyes and wrinkles of trauma. The only words she seemed to be able to find were, "Come and see." In the most maudlin procession, I slowly followed her along the winding path back up to her house, anxiously trying to probe for information. Phoebe gave nothing at all. I knew something was abysmally wrong as I entered the old hospital. I felt a chill as we walked down the lonely corridor of her house. There was a ghostly feeling of something malevolent. When Phoebe opened the door, I didn't want to walk through, but I had to see. I entered. The bleak paintings all over David's room had an added creepiness to them, particularly that giant rendering of the unlucky bushman Taro. The bleak symbolic image of that lone traveller walking a winding and circuitous route through the Aussie bush, beautifully painted with perfect composition and undertones of detailed devilry. Beneath this captivated painting on the wall, David's body lay sprawled, his wrists slashed, a dark pool of crimson surrounding him. The image burned into my retina. There was an hour or so of shock. Me and Phoebe didn't say much. It took a long time to sink in. I'd finally asked, "Why do you think he did it?" But Phoebe had grown colder, then looked into my eyes, shivering, saying, "Flynn, I don't think he took his own life, if that's what you're suggesting." I didn't quite understand the implication. "Does Nora know?" "Nora skipped town. She couldn't handle it. I don't know where she's gone." There was more melancholia, more standing around, not knowing what to do, not knowing what to say. Neither of us felt like heroin. We knew it wouldn't be enough to take the pain away. "Not today." "You need to get out of here," I said at last. "Let's pack the stuff up. We can take my car." Phoebe said nothing until I pressed her. "Come on, let's get out of this horrible town." Phoebe only winced and scowled. "They've blocked off the road." "What?" I asked. "See for yourself." With abandon, I fled home, filling a sack full of my more important belongings, and throwing them in the car. I almost scorched my lawn as I jammed the accelerator and the wheels burnt out. Racing down the old country road, the car rocked, stomping on the loose stones. The wheels moaned and shrieked. For the first time ever, Prime Street was abandoned, nobody in sight. I felt scared, but liberated. I don't know why I hadn't done this a long time ago. The world grew bleaker every second longer I stayed in Bishop's Head. I longed for the chaotic slums of Sydney, for commuter chaos and traffic and being just another number in the system. With positive angling, I barely noticed the roadblocks and the lights before it was too late. Before I knew it, my car was surrounded by rowdy men wearing orange council worker vests, flagging me down. I retain this short entry for prosperity, for this was yesterday, when they first told me there was a fire up the road causing the blockage. They had searched my car, finding the book with the red seal, and making threatening remarks. This was yesterday, though today I am no less in danger. I tell you, these men have taken me into their custody, and I will in a final installment tell you the latter horrible events. For I had played straight into the bastards' hands. They took my keys and bound my hands. I saw them commandeering my car as the lights of the roadblock threw orange over the dusk, and dark events unfurled, as foretold at that fateful meeting place on Serpentine Road. The Mangroves of Bishop's Valley, Chapter 6, Final Chapter, Bishop's Head. I am alone with the horrid truth of it all, a weary fool, stumbling through an incoherent scrub, racing towards nothing, alone with my dictaphone, tricked by a roadblock on Serpentine Road whilst attempting to escape from this soul-destroying valley. Such was my downfall. Like a puppet, I'd almost accepted the ludicrous assertion that there really was a bushfire in Morrowvale, and that this roundabout coup of gruff men in emergency gear were indeed protecting the vulnerable from danger. Blocking all exit from the town for unknown reasons, I allowed the men to search my car. I knew something was off when the men so adamantly turned over every loose item, pulling out the carpets, stripping the seat covers, then scavenging through the boot, even looking through under the spare tire. They had found the evidence they needed in the glove compartment. A particularly pale man with a chiseled jawbone and dark sunglasses approached me with a Luciferian pride in his smile, holding the Red Seal account book up in the air.
"Well, Mr. Flynn, theft of private property. I don't know what the laws are in Sydney, but that's an offence down here in the valley."
I looked at him strangely, taken aback, not understanding what was taking place. Within moments I found myself being manhandled, taken under custody, handcuffed by the notorious Blue Boys and stuck in the back of one of their black Land Rovers. I suspected this had been the plan all along. A convoy of cars drove slowly through the winding residential streets. We descended with concealed purpose, slowly down the muddy road, along the jetty, stopping at the boat ramp. I was violently pulled from the car. Left and right, men were slipping into their ceremonial Ku Klux-like gear, covering their faces with an assortment of frightening hoods and masks, adorned with gold and bronze and strange purple jewelry. The men who had arrested me spat at me now, before he put his own hood on.
"You stupid fucking coon lover,"
he cajoled. Then he pulled the strange-looking mask over his face. I didn't protest, seeing little point defending myself to such mindless barbarians. All the while I was desperately looking for a possible method of escape. My captor pushed me ahead so that my face deflected the whipping branches. I tasted the salt of blood on my tongue. Beams of light shot through the dense trees as we walked the sandy bush path to the mangroves. A motley crew of kookaburras were laughing hysterically in the canopy above. Then came the ear-piercing tonal noise and the curious drumming from far away. There was a dull song of a minor bird as the men pushed me down into the mud. Some of the men then took out their frustrations upon me, unleashing a fury of kicks and punching me in the face and ribs. Then I was dragged through the mud by my collar. The stench of the mangroves was unbearable, with the putrid mud covering my face and steeping into my eyes and mouth. I was taken aback by the blows. Bleeding and barely conscious, I couldn't fully comprehend what was happening as the men escorted me into the shallow water and had begun to hoist me up. A thick post sticking out of the water, to which had been fixed a large wooden structure which resembled a three-pronged swastika. To this enormous variant Y-shape I was now bound, my hands to each of the upper branches, and my feet to the lower, with a durable length of shipping rope. And thus I remained hung on that strange glyph, that wooden icon to their damnable gods, for I can't calculate how long I had watched their strange ceremonies, as they were incalculably attuned to some drug and force, and seemed to move about in purple movements which wandered into celestial patterns. They entered a dream state which I observed, chanting to unknown gods and demons. Oh God, I could perceive then the incalculable shape beyond all space and time of the mangroves itself. It stretched into the ether through invisible flecking spores which danced upward into the moonlight, carrying off endlessly into out of space, as if some colonial life force migrated from the stars in evolutionary patterns that reached into infinity. The disgusting men howled and danced, green goblin-like, unable to be comprehended. Oh, there is something in the mangroves here, in Bishop's Valley. There is something which can't be shaped, which cannot be described. Some monstrous force of all which swallows all goodness in its name. There is something here which transcends the void of space to limitless paths out beyond the inner abyss of the endless universes. Oh dear God, that is what I saw. And only with some cunning which was beyond even myself had I managed to untie the ropes in my hands subtly, and then leap down from that cross, sliding through the wet mud of the mangroves, becoming some incalculable void, my mind a touch and in tune with something foul and unfathomably beyond all known scope of thing. I lost my own shape, my own identity. I became something more than mere I, for the words that we, by the humans, managed to allocate to ourselves out there in the void of men and shapes and things beyond. And oh, the memories came back as I ran off into the bush, as I still run now, recording this journal, blind in the darkness, unsure of what is memory or dream, what is occurring now or what has occurred. Oh dear God, the memories in my mind, for I remember the obscure legends of why this town was called Bishop's Head, and those things which I read in the Gubbles books in the basement. Oh no. Oh no. Oh no, I now know what happened to that famous clerical bishop who disappeared from his Sydney congregation and was believed to have been taken care of down here. Oh, tell me it's all hallucination. Tell me that these bugs and things I see now in the dark, this endless shape which has no bounds, which is I and which is all. Oh, all I see in front of me, the decapitated head, the rotten bishop's head stuck on a pike along the bushy trail in the mangroves, the skin preserved like dried pork in front of me, adorned with strings of garlic, tinsel, and velvet. Oh God! Oh God, have mercy on us all!
God have mercy on us all!
End of The Mangroves of Bishop's Valley by Flynn VanDeBerg.